woke to screaming in the heather. Not human screaming, though God knows it raked my marrow like a child's fingernail on slate. A sound rode the wind in falsetto ribbons, half shriek, half triumph, as though the moor itself had slit its throat and found the deed amusing. I bolted upright in my truckle bed, the thatch above me shuddering with rain, and in the yellow flare of the hearth's dying peat, I saw that every line of the rafters trembled, as if some enormous hand outside were testing the roof for purchase. I dressed without thought, heart hammering tunelessly, and slipped through my sleeping father's kirkhouse, lamp in fist. The latch lifted like a sigh. Outside the night gnashed. Clouds scudded low and tattered, moonlight tearing through them in silver claws. Wind combed the grass in long hysterical strokes, and there, 30 paces away, stood a hare the colour of old snow. It stared at me with eyes so dark they seemed to drink the lamplight, and in their drowning sheen I glimpsed an impossible reflection, not of a beast, but of a woman's face. Smiling, lips red as rowan berries, hair sluiced wet against her throat. The hare winked, or perhaps the woman did. Then it turned, sprang, and vanished into the hissing broom. That was the night everything broke open. We of Canley are born with the wind already in our bones. The town clings to a saddle of land hemmed by peat hags and black water locks. 2 days' ride from any road a map bothers naming. Traders avoid us, so do most birds. What company we keep is the weather, and the weather is fickle, though never coy. It scours flesh, salts milk, flattens wheat, it blows children into ditches if their mothers loosen grip. Father claims it is the Lord's chastening rod, ever raised because we are a stubborn flock. He rings the kirk bell at dawn and dusk, iron cut from a foundered Spanish ship, he says, though none alive recall the wreck, and the clang rolls across the moor like a blacksmith hammering sky. It is meant to herd us back to grace. Instead, it echoes against the standing stones that shoulder above the peat to the west, and the stones answer with a silence that feels older than thunder. On Sabbath eves the bell's last toll still hung in the air when the stories began. We children would slip outside the kirk's lee to trade them in whispers, the white stag seen only on nights when the moon sails upright like a coin, the bone ships that drift landward on fog and leave tide marks of blood on the heather, the witch who wears the shape of a hare. Her name, breathed low, was Aelith. Girls swore they'd glimpsed her at the river, washing linen that never grew clean. Shepherds found their flocks lulled into stupor, eyes filmed, hearts beating slow as winter sap, and on the hill above perched a pale hare, with its ears cocked to some rhythm deeper than lamb bleat or bell. Most tales agreed Aelith could beckon storm or lull it, snare a man's desire and slip it on like a glove, but these were children's warnings, dirges to keep us tidy, to send us to our beds dutiful and dull-eyed. I recited them often enough, my tongue grew numb. Then one afternoon, 2 weeks before the screaming in the heather, I met her. I had been sent to gather bog myrtle for Father's tonic. He allowed no spirits, but drank draughts of swamp tea, so bitter it could blister a liar's mouth. Or, so he told me when I once grimaced at the cup. The errand offered freedom, an hour alone, beyond town, away from the wet stare of Cainley's windows. More in daylight is a dream half-remembered. Lavender haze of bells, sad rattle of seed pods, light shifting like water over drowned roots. I knelt by a pool where sphagnum sighed underfoot, snipping leaves into my basket when the air changed. The breeze faltered, then spun back on itself, brushing my nape with cold fingers. Every bent stem seemed to right itself, as though something had ceased pressing it. Across the pool stood a woman, whose cloak clung to her shoulders as if sculpted from mist. She was young, perhaps my age, perhaps ageless. Hair dark as pond bottom, skin with the pearly inner glow of a snail's shell. Her eyes were the eyes in the hair a fortnight later, wells, not orbs. She smiled, in slow degrees, watching my reflection shiver in the water between us. "Your father's remedy tastes of moss and penance," she said, voice slant as rainfall. I could not rise, knees drowned in bog. "You know my father?" "I know his bell." She crouched, fingertip trailing the pool's skin. "He rings it to keep things out. But bells can be doors too, Moira. She spoke my name the way wind speaks secrets through keyholes. Heat licked my cheeks, though the air smelled of iron. I should go." "You will, but not yet." She dipped her hand deeper. Ripples widened, and in each ripple I saw faces. Mothers, pale and fixed as the day they said fever took her. Fathers, stern beneath his clerical bands. And my own, blurring until it no longer resembled flesh, but something opalescent, shifting, hungry. Cold rose to my thighs. I flinched back. The bog released me with a sucking groan. When I looked again, the woman was gone. In her place crouched a hare. It thumped a hindfoot once, twice, then loped away into broom that closed behind as if stitched by needles of wind. I told no one. But that night I dreamed rain drummed on my eyelids, and a tongue I did not own tasted the salt of it. Father does not strike me. He has never needed to. His silence can flay. He regards deviation the way a surgeon regards rot, something to carve quickly before it spoils the limb entire. Yet he loves me, I think. He brings me codices of sermons, copied in a neat aching hand. He prays over me when fever steals my sleep, his fingertips trembling on my brow as if afraid of what communion might pass skin to skin. Of my mother he speaks sparingly. She was gentle, he says, but fey. The word twitches like a snagged nerve. When I was 8, I asked why there is no headstone bearing her name in the kirkyard. Father pointed toward the moor and quoted scripture about dust returning to dust. I asked nothing more. Since meeting the woman at the pool, I sensed him watching me with added scrutiny, as though my shadow lengthened strangely under candlelight. He sniffed my hair for peat reek when I came in from errands. He questioned the lace I sewed to my cuffs. Why adorn what should be humble? He touched my cheek with a feather-light caress as he asked, yet his eyes gleamed like flint about to spark. In those days the kirk bell seemed louder, heftier, each peal a fist on the ribs. But at odd moments, especially near dusk, I was sure I heard a different note woven under, a counter-ring, breathy and laughing, as though another bell tolled outward from beneath the earth. Answering. Summer waned early that year. Wool sheared from the flocks felt sodden before it reached looms. Still we held the lamb-wake, a rite no scripture condoned, but Father grudgingly permitted so long as no song surpassed a whisper. We gathered on the green with torches dipped against drizzle, and to consecrate the season's first slaughter, there lay on a stone a lamb newborn and already cold. Its eyes had frozen open, glassy beads reflecting flames. Old Lachlan the gravedigger leaned toward me and muttered, "Yon beast knew a secret." He winked a gummy eye. "Don't fret, Mess Moira, I'll plant it deep, so the worms ken nothing." His gallows mirth made me smile despite myself. It died on my lips when smoke shifted and revealed a figure beyond the torch ring. A woman stood against the dark like a slash of wine on slate. Her hair shook in the gusts, yet her cloak scarcely stirred. Townsfolk shuffled, whispers hissed. No one named her. No one approached. But every gaze flicked to Father, and Father's jaw hardened so tight the cords in his neck shivered like taut strings. The rite ended briskly. By morning Lachlan reported the lamb's corpse had vanished. "Left naught but a pelt," he told me with a philosophical shrug. "Skin peeled neat as parchment, heart gone too. Shame. Makes a fine pie." He cackled at my blanch. That evening I found a tuft of white wool caught on our gate. It smelled of heather syrupy with rot. Something was happening beneath my skin. I felt it first while scrubbing floors in the kirk. The water blurred, edges trembling not from my labour, but from a pulse inside the pail. My fingertips numbed. When sensation returned, they tingled with an itch so deep I imagined worms tunneling bone. Rushing outside, I pressed palms to the wet stone wall. The cold soothed, but when I drew them back, tiny filaments clung, filigree roots, delicate, writhing. They recoiled into pores that sealed smooth as though never breached. That night, ever creak of timber in the roof made my joints answer in sympathy. I dreamt of lying beneath peat, lungs breathing water, hair uncoiling through sphagnum like eelgrass. Above, a bell chimed, and the peat answered with a slow bass laugh. Not iron, not any more. I woke gasping, tasting loam. My mouth bled a little from biting my tongue. The blood looked darker than blood should, threaded with motes of green. I burned the sheet with a candle stub in the hearth before dawn. The wind brought her on the equinox. Rain had scoured the sky clear, and the stars glinted cruel and near, as though they leaned lower to spectate. I walked the track toward the standing stones. Why, I could not have said, save that my feet ached unless they followed that path, and found her idling like a broken piece of night-made flesh. A pretty evening, she said, voice hoarse as a rook's. The kind that asks what a girl might be if no one named her first. I asked what she wanted. To give you this. From her cloak she drew nothing, yet between her hands hovered a shimmer like heat over turf. A story, she clarified, lofting it toward me. It drifted, touched my brow like spider silk, and sank inward. I saw a man, my father younger, clutching a woman, who was not my mother, the moor gyring about them in ropes of fog. The woman screamed soundlessly. From her scream uncoiled a hair, sleek and new-birthed, slick with afterbirth that smelled of lightning. The hair blinked at father, with eyes wide to the cosmos. Father raised the kirk bell in both hands. How had he strength? And slammed it down over the animal. The clang burst light, breaking the fog into shards. When the bell lifted, the hair lay stunned, and a woman crawled from beneath it, my mother. Yet her face shifted, oscillating between mine and Aelith's, until identity became a Mobius strip, endless, single-sided. I reeled, vomiting bile laced with strands of living grass. Aelith's hand steadied me. He thought an iron tongue could teach nature its meter, she murmured, but he forged his cage of borrowed metal, and metal weathers. What am I? A question. She smiled without mirth. And an answer he cannot pray shut. Lightning glimmered on the stones. In its flash her shadow split into antlers, and wings and things without name. The next Sabbath father's sermon soared to new heights of vehemence. He denounced harlotry, pagan relics, idle fancy. Each word struck like sleet, hard, flat, abrading. Yet while he thundered, the bell above the nave began to quiver, not swing, simply shiver, vibrating as a string does when another nearby is plucked. No one noticed, but I felt the tremor in my teeth. I pictured fissures threading the bronze, micro-thin, expanding. When service ended, he beckoned me to the vestry. Your colour is poor, he observed. Kneel, child. His hand pressed my crown. He prayed, ardently, urgently. But as he invoked sanctity, I smelt on his breath the sour of fear. My scalp prickled, roots tingled. Beneath his palm something pushed upward, gently, like a sprout meeting thawed soil. He jerked away as if burnt. That night the bell's support cracked. The sound was not a crash, but a sigh, metal meeting flagstone in slow resignation. Townsfolk found it next morning lying on its side, rim fissured like dry earth. Father wept, I heard, though not aloud. His eyes only bled water as he touched the sundered wreck, lips moving. By dusk a mist rolled in, thick as unguent. In it skirl a piping, high, lilting, uncouth. Some swore it was only owls, others barred doors. I opened mine and walked out. Canleas green gleamed slick under lanterns hastily strung. Men bore torches, women clutched Bibles white-knuckled. At their centre father stood, bell-hammer in hand, its head the size of my fist. He must have scavenged it from the fallen tongue. His gaze found mine across the press. I expected fury, saw plea. "Moira," he began, but before he could weave words, the mist tore open and Derleth stepped through. Not cloaked, naked but not nude, her skin furred with down of moss that shimmered like frost. Where her feet touched, grass blackened, then grew again, taller, trembling. "Witch," Father breathed. She cocked her head. "Witch is a word men invented when the earth conversed without their leave." Her eyes slid to me. "Beloved question, are you ready for answer?" Something in my spine unfolded. I felt ribs soften as if they wished to hinge outward. I swallowed a cry. It came out as a noise like a hare squealing. My fingers lengthened, nails translucent, tapering to tips that flexed. The crowd gasped, some in horror, others wonder. Father surged forward, hammer raised. "Do not fear," Derleth told him calmly. "She merely remembers." He swung. She moved, or perhaps the air moved her. The hammer struck stone, sparks spitting, and then torches guttered as wind knifed through. Darkness roared, filled with the sense of wet fur and lightning-split oak. In that din, bodies collided. I felt townfolk's prayers warp into shrieks. Some turned on each other, seeing phantoms ripe for blame. Through it all, Derleth circled Father like tide around rock. "Confess," she whispered. "I caged you," he rasped, "for the child's sake. For your sake. You feared what her mother became. What you let yourself desire. She carried your corruption. I carried your longing love." Their words blurred. My ears rang. Within my chest another drumbeat. Not heart, but hooves, pounding turf. I looked down. My feet had split. No longer feet, but paws, slick with new fur. The bones slid, re-knit. A bloom of terror unfurled, yet beneath it a savage elation, a rightness like gulping air after years underwater. Father saw. Hope flickered, then died. He dropped the hammer. Fell to knees slick with rain. "Moira," he begged. "Daughter." I opened my mouth to answer, but my jaws were wrong shape for speech. What emerged was the scream that had woken me weeks prior. A shrill, exultant cry that braided storm and desire into one endless note. Around us the green writhed. Grass grew taller in seconds, seeding, withering, sprouting again. Time twisted like crushed bell metal. Derleth reached, touched my brow. Where her finger passed, skin dimpled into bark, then smoothed. "Choose," she said. But I understood there was no choice. There was only acknowledgement. At dawn, smoke hung over Kenley. The kirk lay roofless, bell shards scattered like mollusk shells after gull feeding. Of the townsfolk, some remained, kneeling among stones, murmuring prayers that circled back on themselves and went nowhere. Others had fled, leaving doors ajar. No one looked toward the moor, for there the grass undulated as if breathing. Slow, tidal. A lone hare sat upon a hummock, ears black-tipped. Its gaze swept the ruined green with solemn curiosity, as though marvelling at human handiwork. In its eyes drifted reflections, torches, tears, and a pastor's voice, cracked in two. Within the hare, memory coiled like smoke in a shell. It recalled the heat of sermons on its scalp, the taste of moss-bitter tonic, the ache of seams unpicked in darkness so lace might flower unseen. It remembered Father's hand trembling above it, not in anger, but dread of something too beloved to bear. Wind rose, teasing fur, the hair twitched. Beneath its pelt something else sighed, eager to test new sinew against horizon. Across the valley, iron glinted, where bell shards caught sun. A murder of crows settled on them, pecking at rust as if at carrion. Their caws mimicked laughter, that dark, unsettling humour only carrion birds master. The hare's nose twitched once more. Then it bounded off the hummock and melted into broom, tail flicking like a candle snuffed. No humans saw it go. Those who later searched found only double-set prints, as though two creatures had leapt in perfect tandem, one light as breath, the other heavy as prophecy. In years to come, travellers avoided Caerleigh for reasons they could not articulate. Roads warped subtly, milestones misled. The kirk's stones sank inch by inch, pulled downward by roots that smelled of brine, though the sea was leagues away. Some nights folk camping on the fringe heard a bell toll deep underground, answering another bell farther, older, still sinking. They swore the duet sounded almost merry. They might, if bold, have followed it onto the moor and glimpsed a white hare watching them with eyes vast enough to hold every sin ever named, and all the joys never dared. They might have wondered if it once bore a girl's name, but wonder is brittle. Wind is patient. The hare would vanish, leaving only heather seeds in their boots to sprout later where no heather should grow. Back in Caerleigh, a lone pastor kneels nightly beside broken metal, whispering hymns that blow away before reaching heaven. He listens for footsteps that never cross his threshold, yet sometimes the wind brings a familiar scent. Warm peat, rowan berries, a note of laughter. Then he mouths a prayer that ends in a sound strangely like relief or surrender. For daughters taught to fear what waits in the dark may yet learn the dark speaks with their own tongue. And fathers, bless them, will clutch iron even as iron rusts in their hands. After all, rust is only metal, remembering it was once ore, dreaming of earth, longing to return. We all return, sooner or later, carried on the wind's back, and the wind, amused, keeps blowing. When Carson first noticed the sounds in his cellar, he ascribed them to the rats. Later he began to hear the tales which were whispered by the superstitious Polish mill workers in Derby Street regarding the first occupant of the ancient house, Abigail Prynne. There was none living today who could remember the diabolical old hag, but the morbid legends which thrive in the witch district of Salem, like rank weeds on a neglected grave, gave disturbing particulars of her activities, and were unpleasantly explicit regarding the detestable sacrifices she was known to have made to a worm-eaten, crescent-horned image of dubious origin. The oldsters still muttered of Abby Prynne and her monstrous boasts, that she was high priestess of a fearfully potent god, which dwelt deep in the hills. Indeed, it was the old witch's reckless boasting which had led to her abrupt and mysterious death in 1692, about the time of the famous hangings on Gallows Hill. No one liked to talk about it, but occasionally a toothless crone would mumble fearfully that the flames could not burn her, for her whole body had taken on the peculiar anesthesia of her witch mark. Abby Prynne and her anomalous statue had long since vanished, but it was still difficult to find tenants for her decrepit gabled house, with its overhanging second story and curious diamond-paned casement windows. The house's evil notoriety had spread throughout Salem. Nothing had actually happened there of recent years which might give rise to the inexplicable tales, but those who rented the house had a habit of moving out hastily, generally with vague and unsatisfactory explanations connected with the rats. And it was a rat which led Carson to the witch room. The squealing and muffled pattering within the rotting walls had disturbed Carson more than once during the nights of his first week in the house, which he had rented to obtain the solitude that would enable him to complete a novel for which his publishers had been asking. Another light romance to add to Carson's long string of popular successes. But it was not until some time later that he began to entertain certain wildly fantastic surmises regarding the intelligence of the rat that scurried from under his feet in the dark hallway one evening. The house had been wired for electricity, but the bulb in the hall was small and gave a dim light. The rat was a misshapen black shadow as it darted a few feet away and paused, apparently watching him. At another time, Carson might have dismissed the animal with a threatening gesture and returned to his work. But the traffic on Derby Street had been unusually noisy, and he had found it difficult to concentrate upon his novel. His nerves, for no apparent reason, were taut, and somehow it seemed that the rat, watching just beyond his reach, was eyeing him with sardonic amusement. Smiling at the conceit, he took a few steps toward the rat, and it rushed away to the cellar door, which he saw with surprise was ajar. He must have neglected to close it the last time he had been in the cellar, although he generally took care to keep the doors shut, for the ancient house was draughty. The rat waited in the doorway. Unreasonably annoyed, Carson hurried forward, sending the rat scurrying down the stairway. He switched on the cellar light and observed the rat in a corner. It watched him keenly out of glittering little eyes. As he descended the stairs, he could not help feeling that he was acting like a fool. But his work had been tiring, and subconsciously he welcomed any interruption. He moved across the cellar to the rat, seeing with astonishment that the creature remained unmoving, staring at him. A strange feeling of uneasiness began to grow within him. The rat was acting abnormally, he felt, and the unwinking gaze of its cold shoe-button eyes was somehow disturbing. Then he laughed to himself, for the rat had suddenly whisked aside and disappeared into a little hole in the cellar wall. Idly he scratched a cross with his toe in the dirt before the burrow, deciding that he would set a trap there in the morning. The rat's snout and ragged whiskers protruded cautiously. It moved forward and then hesitated, drew back. Then the animal began to act in a singular and unaccountable manner, almost as though it were dancing, Carson thought. It moved tentatively forward, retreated again. It would give a little dart forward and be brought up short, then leap back hastily, as though, the simile flashed into Carson's mind, a snake were coiled before the burrow, alert to prevent the rat's escape. But there was nothing there save the little cross Carson had scratched in the dust. No doubt it was Carson himself who blocked the rat's escape, for he was standing within a few feet of the burrow. He moved forward, and the animal hurriedly retreated out of sight. His interest piqued, Carson found a stick and poked it exploringly into the hole. As he did so, his eye, close to the wall, detected something strange about the stone slab just above the rat burrow. A quick glance around its edge confirmed his suspicion. The slab was apparently movable. Carson examined it closely, noticed a depression on its edge which would afford a handhold. His fingers fitted easily into the groove, and he pulled tentatively. The stone moved a trifle and stopped. He pulled harder, and with a sprinkling of dry earth, the slab swung away from the wall as though on hinges. A black rectangle, shoulder-high, gaped in the wall. From its depths, a musty, unpleasant stench of dead air welled out, and, involuntarily, Carson retreated a step. Suddenly he remembered the monstrous tales of Abby Prynne and the hideous secrets she was supposed to have kept hidden in her house. Had he stumbled upon some hidden retreat of the long-dead witch? Before entering the dark gap, he took the precaution of obtaining a flashlight from upstairs. Then he cautiously bent his head and stepped into the narrow, evil-smelling passage, sending the flashlight's beam probing out before him. He was in a narrow tunnel, scarcely higher than his head, and walled and paved with stone slabs. It ran straight ahead for perhaps 15 feet, and then broadened out into a roomy chamber. As Carson stepped into the underground room, no doubt a hidden retreat of Abby Prynne's, a hiding place, he thought, which nevertheless could not save her on the day the fright-crazed mob had come raging along Derby Street. He caught his breath in a gasp of amazement. The room was fantastic, astonishing. It was the floor which held Carson's gaze. The dull grey of the circular wall gave place here to a mosaic of vari-coloured stone, in which blues and greens and purples predominated. Indeed, there were none of the warmer colours. There must have been thousands of bits of coloured stone making up that pattern, for none was larger than a walnut, and the mosaic seemed to follow some definite pattern, unfamiliar to Carson. There were curves of purple and violet mingled with angled lines of green and blue, intertwining in fantastic arabesques. There were circles, triangles, a pentagram, and other, less familiar figures. Most of the lines and figures radiated from a definite point, the center of the chamber, where there was a circular disk of dead black stone, perhaps 2 feet in diameter. It was very silent. The sounds of the cars that occasionally went past overhead in Derby Street could not be heard. In a shallow alcove in the wall, Carson caught a glimpse of markings on the walls, and he moved slowly in that direction, the beam of his light travelling up and down the walls of the niche. The marks, whatever they were, had been daubed upon the stone long ago, for what was left of the cryptic symbols was indecipherable. Carson saw several partly effaced hieroglyphics, which reminded him of Arabic, but he could not be sure. On the floor of the alcove was a corroded metal disc about 8 feet in diameter, and Carson received the distinct impression that it was movable, but there seemed no way to lift it. He became conscious that he was standing in the exact center of the chamber, in the circle of black stone where the odd design centered. Again he noticed the utter silence. On an impulse he clicked off the ray of his flashlight. Instantly he was in dead blackness. At that moment a curious idea entered his mind. He pictured himself at the bottom of a pit, and from above a flood was descending, pouring down the shaft to engulf him. So strong was this impression that he actually fancied he could hear a muffled thundering, the roar of the cataract. Then, oddly shaken, he clicked on the light, glanced around swiftly. The drumming, of course, was the pounding of his blood, made audible in the complete silence, a familiar phenomenon. But if the place was so still, the thought leapt into his mind, as though suddenly thrust into his consciousness. This would be an ideal place to work. He could have the place wired for electricity, have a table and chair brought down, use an electric fan if necessary, although the musty odor he had first noticed seemed to have disappeared completely. He moved to the tunnel mouth, and as he stepped from the room he felt an inexplicable relaxation of his muscles, although he had not realized that they had been contracted. He ascribed it to nervousness and went upstairs to brew black coffee and write to his landlord in Boston about his discovery. The visitor stared curiously about the hallway after Carson had opened the door, nodding to himself as though with satisfaction. He was a lean, tall figure of a man, with thick steel-grey eyebrows overhanging keen grey eyes. His face, although strongly marked and gaunt, was unwrinkled. "About the witch room, I suppose," Carson said ungraciously. His landlord had talked, and for the last week he had been unwillingly entertaining antiquaries and occultists, anxious to glimpse the secret chamber in which Abby Prynne had mumbled her spells. Carson's annoyance had grown, and he had considered moving to a quieter place, but his inherent stubbornness had made him stay on, determined to finish his novel in spite of interruptions. Now, eyeing his guest coldly, he said, "I'm sorry, but it's not on exhibition anymore." The other looked startled, but almost immediately a gleam of comprehension came into his eyes. He extracted a card and offered it to Carson. "Michael Lee, occultist, eh?" Carson repeated. He drew a deep breath. The occultists, he had found, were the worst, with their dark hints of nameless things and their profound interest in the mosaic pattern on the floor of the witch room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lee, but I'm really quite busy. You'll excuse me." Ungraciously he turned back to the door. "Just a moment," Lee said swiftly. Before Carson could protest, he had caught the writer by the shoulders and was peering closely into his eyes. Startled, Carson drew back, but not before he had seen an extraordinary expression of mingled apprehension and satisfaction appear on Lee's gaunt face. It was as though the occultist had seen something unpleasant, but not unexpected. "What's the idea?" Carson asked harshly. "I'm not accustomed." "I'm very sorry," Lee said. His voice was deep, pleasant. "I must apologize. I thought, well, again, I apologize. I'm rather excited, I'm afraid. You see, I've come from San Francisco to see this witch room of yours. Would you really mind letting me see it? I should be glad to pay any sum. Carson made a deprecatory gesture. No, he said, feeling a perverse liking for this man growing within him. His well-modulated, pleasant voice, his powerful face, his magnetic personality. No, I merely want a little peace. You have no idea how I've been bothered, he went on, vaguely surprised to find himself speaking apologetically. It's a frightful nuisance. I almost wish I'd never found the room. Lee leaned forward anxiously. May I see it? It means a great deal to me. I'm vitally interested in these things. I promise not to take up more than 10 minutes of your time. Carson hesitated, then assented. As he led his guest into the cellar, he found himself telling the circumstances of his discovery of the witch room. Lee listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions. The rat? Did you see what became of it? He asked. Carson looked bemused. Why, no, I suppose it hid in its burrow. Why? One never knows, Leigh said cryptically as they came into the witch room. Carson switched on the light. He had had an electrical extension installed, and there were a few chairs and a table, but otherwise the chamber was unchanged. Carson watched the occultist's face, and with surprise saw it become grim, almost angry. Lee strode to the center of the room, staring at the chair that stood on the black circle of stone. You work here? He asked slowly. Yes. It's quiet. I found I couldn't work upstairs. Too noisy. But this is ideal. Somehow I find it very easy to write here. My mind feels... He hesitated. Free. That is, disassociated with other things. It's quite an unusual feeling. Lee nodded as though Carson's words had confirmed some idea in his own mind. He turned toward the alcove and the metal disc in the floor. Carson followed him. The occultist moved close to the wall, tracing out the faded symbols with a long forefinger. He muttered something under his breath. Words that sounded like gibberish to Carson. Nogdok Hieronik. He swung about, his face grim and pale. I've seen enough, he said softly. Shall we go? Surprised, Carson nodded and led the way back into the cellar. Upstairs, Lee hesitated, as though finding it difficult to broach his subject. At length he asked, Mr. Carson, would you mind telling me if you have had any peculiar dreams lately? Carson stared at him, mirth dancing in his eyes. Dreams, he repeated. Oh, I see. Well, Mr. Lee, I may as well tell you that you can't frighten me. Your compatriots, the other occultists I've entertained, have already tried it. Lee raised his thick eyebrows. Yes? Did they ask you whether you dreamed? Several did. Yes. And you told them? No. Then, as Lee leaned back in his chair, a puzzled expression on his face, Carson went on slowly. Although really, I'm not quite sure. You mean, I think? I have a vague impression that I have dreamed lately, but I can't be sure. I can't remember anything of the dream, you see, and... Oh, very probably your brother occultists put the idea into my mind. Perhaps, Lee said noncommittally, getting up. He hesitated. Mr. Carson, I'm going to ask you a rather presumptuous question. Is it necessary for you to live in this house? Carson sighed resignedly. Where I was first asked that question, I explained that I wanted a quiet place to work on a novel, and that any quiet place would do. But it isn't easy to find them. Now that I have this witch room, and I'm turning out my work so easily, I see no reason why I should move and perhaps upset my program. I'll vacate this house when I finish my novel, and then you occultists can come in and turn it into a museum or do whatever you want with it. I don't care. But until the novel is finished, I intend to stay here." Lee rubbed his chin. "Indeed. I can understand your point of view, but is there no other place in the house where you can work?" He watched Carson's face for a moment, and then went on swiftly. "I don't expect you to believe me. You are a materialist. Most people are. But there are a few of us who know that above and beyond what men call science, there is a greater science that is built on laws and principles which to the average man would be almost incomprehensible. If you have read Mackin, you will remember that he speaks of the gulf between the world of consciousness and the world of matter. It is possible to bridge that gulf. The witch room is such a bridge. Do you know what a whispering gallery is?" "What?" Carson said, staring. "But there's no... An analogy. Merely an analogy. A man may whisper a word in gallery, or a cave, and if you are standing in a certain spot 100 feet away, you will hear that whisper, although someone 10 feet away will not. It's a simple trick of acoustics, bringing the sound to a focal point. And this principle can be applied to other things besides sound, to any wave impulse, even to thought." Carson tried to interrupt, but Leigh kept on. "The black stone in the center of your witch room is one of those focal points. The design on the floor. When you sit on the black circle there, you are abnormally sensitive to certain vibrations, certain thought commands, dangerously sensitive. Why do you suppose your mind is so clear when you are working there? A deception, a false feeling of lucidity. For you are merely an instrument, a microphone, tuned to pick up certain malign vibrations, the nature of which you could not comprehend." Carson's face was a study in amazement and incredulity. "But you don't mean you actually believe?" Leigh drew back, the intensity fading from his eyes, leaving them grim and cold. "Very well, but I have studied the history of your Abigail Prynne. She too understood the super-science of which I speak. She used it for evil purposes, the black art, as it is called. I have read that she cursed Salem in the old days, and a witch's curse can be a frightful thing. Will you—" He got up, gnawing at his lip. "Will you at least allow me to call on you tomorrow?" Almost involuntarily Carson nodded. "But I'm afraid you'll be wasting your time. I don't believe... I have no..." He stumbled, at a loss for words. "I merely wish to assure myself that you... Oh, another thing. If you dream tonight, will you try to remember the dream? If you attempt to recapture it immediately after waking, it is often possible to recall it." "All right, if I dream..." That night Carson dreamed. He awoke just before dawn with his heart racing furiously and a curious feeling of uneasiness. Within the walls and from below he could hear the furtive scurryings of the rats. He got out of bed hastily, shivering in the cold greyness of early morning. A wan moon still shone faintly in a paling sky. Then he remembered Leigh's words. He had dreamed. There was no question of that. But the content of his dream? That was another matter. He absolutely could not recall it to his mind, much as he tried, although there was a very vague impression of running frantically in darkness. He dressed quickly, and because the stillness of early morning in the old house got on his nerves, went out to buy a newspaper. It was too early for shops to be open, however, and in search of a newsboy he set off westward, turning at the first corner. And as he walked, a curious and inexplicable feeling began to take possession of him, a feeling of familiarity. He had walked here before, and there was a dim and disturbing familiarity about the shapes of the houses, the outline of the roofs. But, and this was the fantastic part of it, to his knowledge he had never been on this street before. He had spent little time walking about this region of Salem, for he was indolent by nature. Yet there was this extraordinary feeling of remembrance, and it grew more vivid as he went on. He reached a corner, turned unthinkingly to the left. The odd sensation increased. He walked on slowly, pondering. No doubt he had travelled by this way before, and very probably he had done so in a brown study, so that he had not been conscious of his route. Undoubtedly that was the explanation. Yet as Carson turned into Charter Street, he felt a nameless unease waking within him. Salem was rousing. With daylight, impassive polish workers began to hurry past him toward the mills. An occasional automobile went by. Before him a crowd was gathered on the sidewalk. He hastened his steps, conscious of a feeling of impending calamity. With an extraordinary sense of shock, he saw that he was passing the Charter Street burying ground, the ancient, evil-famous burying point. Hastily he pushed his way into the crowd. Comments in a muffled undertone came to Carson's ears, and a bulky blue-clad back loomed up before him. He peered over the policeman's shoulder and caught his breath in a horrified gasp. Man leaned against the iron railing that fenced the old graveyard. He wore a cheap, gaudy suit, and he gripped the rusty bars in a clutch that made the muscles stand out in ridges on the hairy backs of his hands. He was dead, and on his face, staring up at the sky at a crazy angle, was frozen, an expression of abysmal and utterly shocking horror. His eyes, all whites, were bulging hideously. His mouth was a twisted, mirthless grin. A man at Carson's side turned a white face toward him. "Looks as if he was scared to death," he said somewhat hoarsely. "I'd hate to have seen what he saw. Ugh, look at that face." Mechanically, Carson backed away, feeling an icy breath of nameless things chill him. He rubbed his hand across his eyes, but still that contorted, dead face swam in his vision. He began to retrace his steps, shaken and trembling a little. Involuntarily his glance moved aside, rested on the tombs and monuments that dotted the old graveyard. No one had been buried there for over a century, and the lichen-stained tombstones, with their winged skulls, fat-cheeked cherubs, and funeral urns, seemed to breathe out an indefinable miasma of antiquity. What had frightened the man to death? Carson drew a deep breath. True, the corpse had been a frightful spectacle, but he must not allow it to upset his nerves. He could not. His novel would suffer. Besides, he argued grimly to himself, the affair was obvious enough in its explanation. The dead man was apparently a Pole, one of the group of immigrants who dwell about Salem Harbor. Passing by the graveyard at night, a spot about which eldritch legends had clung for nearly 3 centuries, his drink-befuddled eyes must have given reality to the hazy phantoms of a superstitious mind. These Poles were notoriously unstable emotionally, prone to mob hysteria and wild imaginings. The great immigrant panic of 1853, in which 3 witch houses had been burned to the ground, had grown from an old woman's confused and hysterical statement that she had seen a mysterious white-clad foreigner take off his face. What else could be expected of such people, Carson thought. Nevertheless, he remained in a nervous state and did not return home until nearly noon. When on his arrival he found Lay, the occultist, waiting, he was glad to see the man and invited him in with cordiality. Lay was very serious. "Did you hear about your friend Abigail Prynne?" he asked without preamble, and Carson stared, pausing in the act of siphoning charged water into a glass. After a long moment he pressed the lever, sent the liquid sizzling and foaming into the whiskey. He handed Lay the drink and took one himself. Neat, before answering the question. "I don't know what you're talking about. What's she been up to?" he asked, with an air of forced levity. "I've been checking up the records," Lee said, "and I find Abigail Prynne was buried on December 14th, 1690, in the Charter Street burying ground, with a stake through her heart. What's the matter?" Nothing, Carson said tonelessly. Well, her grave's been opened and robbed, that's all. The stake was found uprooted nearby, and there were footprints all around the grave. Shoe prints. Did you dream last night, Carson? Lee snapped out the question, his grey eyes hard. I don't know, Carson said confusedly, rubbing his forehead. I can't remember. I was at the Charter Street graveyard this morning. Oh, then you must have heard something about the man who... I saw him, Carson interrupted, shuddering. It upset me. He downed the whiskey at a gulp. Lee watched him. Well, he said presently, are you still determined to stay in this house? Carson put down the glass and stood up. Why not? He snapped. Is there any reason why I shouldn't? After what happened last night. After what happened? A grave was robbed. A superstitious Pole saw the robbers and died of fright. Well? You're trying to convince yourself, Lee said calmly. In your heart you know. You must know. The truth. You've become a tool in the hands of tremendous, terrible forces, Carson. For 3 centuries Abby Prynne has lain in her grave, undead, waiting for someone to fall into her trap. The witch room. Perhaps she foresaw the future when she built it, foresaw that someday someone would blunder into that hellish chamber and be caught by the trap of the mosaic pattern. It caught you, Carson, and enabled that undead horror to bridge the gulf between consciousness and matter, to get en rapport with you. Hypnotism is child's play to a being with Abigail Prynne's frightful powers. She could very easily force you to go to her grave and uproot the stake that held her captive, and then erase the memory of that act from your mind so that you could not remember it even as a dream. Carson was on his feet, his eyes burning with a strange light. In God's name, man, do you know what you're saying? Lee laughed harshly. God's name, the devil's name, rather. The devil that menaces Salem at this moment. For Salem is in danger, terrible danger. The men and women and children of the town, Abby Prynne cursed when they bound her to the stake and found they couldn't burn her. I've been going through certain secret archives this morning, and I've come to ask you, for the last time, to leave this house. Are you through? Carson asked coldly. Very well. I shall stay here. You're either insane or drunk, but you can't impress me with your poppycock. Would you leave if I offered you $1,000? Lee asked. Or more, then. 10,000. I have a considerable sum at my command. No, damn it, Carson snapped in a sudden blaze of anger. All I want is to be left alone to finish my novel. I can't work anywhere else. I don't want to. I won't. I expected this, Leigh said, his voice suddenly quiet and with a strange note of sympathy. Man, you can't get away. You're caught in the trap, and it's too late for you to extricate yourself so long as Abby Prynne's brain controls you through the witch room. And the worst part of it is that she can only manifest herself with your aid. She drains your life forces, Carson, feeds on you like a vampire. You're mad, Carson said dully. I'm afraid. That iron disc in the witch room, I'm afraid of that and what's under it. Abby Prynne served strange gods, Carson. And I read something on the wall of that alcove that gave me a hint. Have you ever heard of Neoga? Carson shook his head impatiently. Lee fumbled in a pocket, drew out a scrap of paper. I copied this from a book in the Kester Library, he said. A book called the Necronomicon, written by a man who delved so deeply into forbidden secrets that men called him mad. Read this. Carson's brows drew together as he read the excerpt. Men know him as the Dweller in Darkness, that brother of the Old Ones called Neogta, the thing that should not be. He can be summoned to Earth's surface through certain secret caverns and fissures, and sorcerers have seen him in Syria and below the Black Tower of Leng. From the Thang Grotto of Tartary he has come ravening to bring terror and destruction among the pavilions of the great Khan. Only by the looped cross, by the Varch Viraj incantation, and by the Tikkun elixir may he be driven back to the nighted caverns of hidden foulness where he dwelleth. Lee met Carson's puzzled gaze calmly. Do you understand now? Incantations and elixirs, Carson said, handing back the paper. Fiddlesticks. Far from it. That incantation and that elixir have been known to occultists and adepts for thousands of years. I've had occasion to use them myself in the past on certain occasions, and if I'm right about this thing... He turned to the door, his lips compressed in a bloodless line. Such manifestations have been defeated before, but the difficulty lies in obtaining the elixir. It's very hard to get, but I hope I'll be back. Can you stay out of the witch room until then? I'll promise nothing, Carson said. He had a dull headache which had been steadily growing until it obtruded upon his consciousness, and he felt vaguely nauseated. Goodbye. He saw Lay to the door and waited on the steps with an odd reluctance to return to the house. As he watched the tall occultist hurry down the street, a woman came out of the adjoining house. She caught sight of him, and her huge breasts heaved. She burst into a shrill, angry tirade. Carson turned, staring at her with astonished eyes. His head throbbed painfully. The woman was approaching, shaking a fat fist threateningly. "Why you scare my Sarah?" she cried, her swarthy face flushed. "Why you scare her wit, your fool tricks, eh?" Carson moistened his lips. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "very sorry. I didn't frighten your Sarah. I haven't been home all day. What frightened her?" "The brown thing. It ran in your house, Sarah say." The woman paused, and her jaw dropped. Her eyes widened. She made a peculiar sign with her right hand, pointing her index and little fingers at Carson, while her thumb was crossed over the other fingers. "T old witch!" She retreated hastily, muttering in Polish in a frightened voice. Carson turned, went back into the house. He poured some whiskey into a tumbler, considered, and then set it aside untasted. He began to pace the floor, occasionally rubbing his forehead with fingers that felt dry and hot. Vague, confused thoughts raced through his mind. His head was throbbing and feverish. At length he went down to the witch room. He remained there, although he did not work, for his headache was not so oppressive in the dead quiet of the underground chamber. After a time he slept. How long he slumbered he did not know. He dreamed of Salem, and of a dimly glimpsed, gelatinous black thing that hurtled with frightful speed through the streets, a thing like an incredibly huge, jet-black amoeba that pursued and engulfed men and women who shrieked and fled vainly. He dreamed of a skull face peering into his own, a withered and shrunken countenance in which only the eyes seemed alive, and they shone with a hellish and evil light. He awoke at last, sat up with a start. He was very cold. It was utterly silent. In the light of the electric bulb, the green and purple mosaic seemed to writhe and contract toward him, an illusion which disappeared as his sleep-fogged vision cleared. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was 2:00. He had slept through the afternoon and the better part of the night. He felt oddly weak, and a lassitude held him motionless in his chair. The strength seemed to have been drained from him. The piercing cold seemed to strike through to his brain. But his headache was gone. His mind was very clear, expectant, as though waiting for something to happen. A movement nearby caught his eye. A slab of stone in the wall was moving. He heard a gentle grating sound, and slowly a black cavity widened from a narrow rectangle to a square. There was something crouching there in the shadow. Stark, blind horror struck through Carson as the thing moved and crept forward into the light. It looked like a mummy. For an intolerable, age-long second, the thought pounded frightfully at Carson's brain. It looked like a mummy. It was a skeleton, thin, parchment-brown corpse, and it looked like a skeleton with the hide of some great lizard stretched over its bones. It stirred, it crept forward, and its long nails scratched audibly against the stone. It crawled out into the witch room, its passionless face pitilessly revealed in the white light, and its eyes were gleaming with charnel life. He could see the serrated ridge of its brown, shrunken back. Carson sat motionless. Abysmal horror had robbed him of the power to move. He seemed to be caught in the fetters of dream paralysis, in which the brain, an aloof spectator, is unable or unwilling to transmit the nerve impulses to the muscles. He told himself frantically that he was dreaming, that he would presently awaken. The withered horror arose. It stood upright, skeleton thin, and moved to the alcove where the iron disc lay embedded in the floor. Standing with its back to Carson, it paused, and a dry and sere whisper rustled out in the dead stillness. At the sound, Carson would have screamed, but he could not. Still the dreadful whisper went on, in a language Carson knew was not of earth, and as though in response an almost imperceptible quiver shook the iron disc. It quivered and began to rise, very slowly, and as if in triumph the shriveled horror lifted its pipe-stem arms. The disc was nearly a foot thick, but presently as it continued to rise above the level of the floor, an insidious odour began to penetrate the room. It was vaguely reptilian, musky and nauseating. The disc lifted inexorably, and a little finger of blackness crept out from beneath its edge. Abruptly Carson remembered his dream of a gelatinous black creature that hurtled through the Salem streets. He tried vainly to break the fetters of paralysis that held him motionless. The chamber was darkening, and a black vertigo was creeping up to engulf him. The room seemed to rock. Still the iron disc lifted, still the withered horror stood, with its skeleton arms raised in blasphemous benediction. Still the blackness oozed out in slow amoeboid movement. There came a sound breaking through the sere whisper of the mummy, the quick patter of racing footsteps. Out of the corner of his eye Carson saw a man come racing into the witch room. It was the occultist, Lee, and his eyes were blazing in a face of deathly pallor. He flung himself past Carson to the alcove where the black horror was surging into view. The withered thing turned with dreadful slowness. Lee carried some implement in his left hand, Carson saw, a crux ansata of gold and ivory. His right hand was clenched at his side. His voice rolled out, sonorous and commanding. There were little beads of perspiration on his white face. Bernakadish tunil geriger, stelbsnach nanyogdoki, kjarnak flegator. The fantastic, unearthly syllables thundered out, echoing from the walls of the vault. Lee advanced slowly, the crux ansata held high, and from beneath the iron disc, black horror came surging. The disc was lifted, flung aside, and a great wave of iridescent blackness, neither liquid nor solid, a frightful gelatinous mass, came pouring straight for Lay. Without pausing in his advance, he made a quick gesture with his right hand, and a little glass tube hurtled at the black thing, was engulfed. The formless horror paused. It hesitated, with a dreadful air of indecision, and then swiftly drew back. A choking stench of burning corruption began to pervade the air, and Carson saw great pieces of the black thing flake off, shriveling as though destroyed with corroding acid. It fled back in a liquescent rush, hideous black flesh dropping as it retreated. A pseudopod of blackness elongated itself from the central mass, and like a great tentacle clutched the corpse-like being, dragged it back to the pit and over the brink. Another tentacle seized the iron disc, pulled it effortlessly across the floor, and as the horror sank from sight, the disc fell into place with a thunderous crash. The room swung in wide circles about Carson, and a frightful nausea clutched him. He made a tremendous effort to get to his feet, and then the light faded swiftly and was gone. Darkness took him. Carson's novel was never finished. He burned it, but continued to write, although none of his later work was ever published. His publishers shook their heads and wondered why such a brilliant writer of popular fiction had suddenly become infatuated with the weird and ghastly. "It's powerful stuff," one man told Carson as he handed back his novel, Black God of Madness. "It's remarkable in its way, but it's morbid and horrible. Nobody would read it." "Carson, why don't you write the type of novel you used to do, the kind that made you famous?" It was then that Carson broke his vow never to speak of the witch room, and he poured out the entire story, hoping for understanding and belief. But as he finished, his heart sank as he saw the other's face, sympathetic but skeptical. "You dreamed it, didn't you?" the man asked, and Carson laughed bitterly. "Yes, I dreamed it. It must have made a terribly vivid impression on your mind. Some dreams do. But you'll forget about it in time," he predicted, and Carson nodded. And because he knew that he would only be arousing doubts of his sanity, he did not mention the thing that was burned indelibly on his brain, the horror he had seen in the witch room after wakening from his faint. Before he and Lee had hurried white-faced and trembling from the chamber, Carson had cast a quick glance behind him. The shriveled and corroded patches that he had seen slough off from that being of insane blasphemy had unaccountably disappeared, although they had left black stains upon the stones. Abby Prynne, perhaps, had returned to the hell she had served, and her inhuman god had withdrawn to hidden abysses beyond man's comprehension, routed by powerful forces of elder magic which the occultist had commanded. The witch had left a memento behind her, a hideous thing which Carson, in that last backward glance, had seen protruding from the edge of the iron disc, as though raised in ironic salute. A withered, claw-like hand. Close to the village street stood the one-story house in which Luella Miller, who had an evil name in the village, had dwelt. She had been dead for years, yet there were those in the village who, in spite of the clearer light which comes on a vantage point from a long-past danger, half believed in the tale which they had heard from their childhood. In their hearts, although they scarcely would have owned it, was a survival of the wild horror and frenzied fear of their ancestors who had dwelt in the same age with Luella Miller. Young people even would stare with a shudder at the old house as they passed, and children never played around it as was their wont around an untenanted building. Not a window in the old Miller house was broken. The panes reflected the morning sunlight in patches of emerald and blue, and the latch of the sagging front door was never lifted, although no bolt secured it. Since Luella Miller had been carried out of it, the house had had no tenant except one friendless old soul, who had no choice between that and the far-off shelter of the open sky. This old woman, who had survived her kindred and friends, lived in the house 1 week. Then, one morning, no smoke came out of the chimney, and a body of neighbours, a score strong, entered and found her dead in her bed. There were dark whispers as to the cause of her death, and there were those who testified to an expression of fear so exalted that it showed forth the state of the departing soul upon the dead face. The old woman had been hale and hearty when she entered the house, and in 7 days she was dead. It seemed that she had fallen a victim to some uncanny power. The minister talked in the pulpit with covert severity against the sin of superstition. Still, the belief prevailed. Not a soul in the village but would have chosen the almshouse rather than that dwelling. No vagrant, if he heard the tale, would seek shelter beneath that old roof, unhallowed by nearly half a century of superstitious fear. There was only one person in the village who had actually known Luella Miller. That person was a woman well over 80, but a marvel of vitality and unextinct youth. Straight as an arrow, with the spring of one recently let loose from the bow of life, she moved about the streets, and she always went to church, rain or shine. She had never married, and had lived alone for years in a house across the road from Luella Miller's. This woman had none of the garrulousness of age, but never in all her life had she ever held her tongue for any will save her own, and she never spared the truth when she essayed to present it. She it was who bore testimony to the life, evil, though possibly wittingly or designedly so, of Luella Miller, and to her personal appearance. When this old woman spoke, and she had the gift of description, although her thoughts were clothed in the rude vernacular of her native village, one could seem to see Luella Miller as she had really looked. According to this woman, Lydia Anderson by name, Luella Miller had been a beauty of a type rather unusual in New England. She had been a slight, pliant sort of creature, as ready with a strong yielding to fate, and as unbreakable as a willow. She had glimmering lengths of straight, fair hair which she wore softly looped round a long, lovely face. She had blue eyes full of soft pleading, little slender, clinging hands, and a wonderful grace of motion and attitude. Luella Miller used to sit in a way nobody else could if they sat up and studied a week of Sundays, said Lydia Anderson, and it was a sight to see her walk. If one of them willows over there on the edge of the brook could start up and get its roots free of the ground and move off, it would go just the way Luella Miller used to. She had a green shot silk she used to wear, too, and a hat with green ribbon streamers, and a lace veil blowing across her face and out sideways, and a green ribbon flying from her waist. That was what she came out bride in when she married Erastus Miller. Her name before she was married was Hill. There was always a sight of L's in her name, married or single. Erastus Miller was good-looking, too, better looking than Luella. Sometimes I used to think that Luella wasn't so handsome after all. Erastus just about worshipped her. I used to know him pretty well. He lived next door to me, and we went to school together. Folks used to say he was waiting on me, but he wasn't. I never thought he was, except once or twice, when he said things that some girls might have suspected meant something. That was before Luella came here to teach the district school. It was funny how she came to get it, for folks said she hadn't any education, and that one of the big girls, Lottie Henderson, used to do all the teaching for her, while she sat back and did embroidery work on a cambric pocket handkerchief. Lottie Henderson was a real smart girl, a splendid scholar, and she just set her eyes by Luella, as all the girls did. Lottie would have made a real smart woman, but she died when Luella had been here about a year. Just faded away and died. Nobody knew what ailed her. She dragged herself to that schoolhouse and helped Luella teach till the very last minute. The committee all knew how Luella didn't do much of the work herself, but they winked at it. It wasn't long after Lottie died that Erastus married her. I always thought he hurried it up because she wasn't fit to teach. One of the big boys used to help her after Lottie died, but he hadn't much government, and the school didn't do very well, and Luella might have had to give it up, for the committee couldn't have shut their eyes to things much longer. The boy that helped her was a real honest, innocent sort of fellow, and he was a good scholar too. Folks said he overstudied, and that was the reason he was took crazy the year after Luella married. But I don't know, and I don't know what made Erastus Miller go into consumption of the blood the year after he was married. Consumption wasn't in his family. He just grew weaker and weaker, and went almost bent double when he tried to wait on Luella, and he spoke feeble, like an old man. He worked terrible hard till the last, trying to save up a little to leave Luella. I've seen him out in the worst storms on a wood sled. He used to cut and sell wood, and he was hunched up on top, looking more dead than alive. Once I couldn't stand it. I went over and helped him pitch some wood on the cart. I was always strong in my arms. I wouldn't stop for all he told me to, and I guess he was glad enough for the help. That was only a week before he died. He fell on the kitchen floor while he was getting breakfast. He always got the breakfast and let Luella lay abed. He did all the sweeping and the washing and the ironing and most of the cooking. He couldn't bear to have Luella lift her finger, and she let him do for her. She lived like a queen for all the work she did. She didn't even do her sewing. She said it made her shoulder ache to sew, and poor Erastus's sister Lily used to do all her sewing. She wasn't able to either. She was never strong in her back, but she did it beautifully. She had to suit Luella. She was so dreadful particular. I never saw anything like the faggoting and hemstitching that Lily Miller did for Luella. She made all Luella's wedding outfit, and that green silk dress after Maria Babbitt cut it. Maria, she cut it for nothing, and she did a lot more cutting and fitting for nothing for Luella too. Lily Miller went to live with Luella after Erastus died. She gave up her home, though she was real attached to it, and wasn't a mite afraid to stay alone. She rented it, and she went to live with Luella right away after the funeral. Then, this old woman, Lydia Anderson, who remembered Luella Miller, would go on to relate the story of Lily Miller. It seemed that on the removal of Lily Miller to the house of her dead brother, to live with his widow, the village people first began to talk. This Lily Miller had been hardly past her first youth, and a most robust and blooming woman, rosy-cheeked, with curls of strong black hair overshadowing round, candid temples and bright dark eyes. It was not 6 months after she had taken up her residence with her sister-in-law that her rosy colour faded, and her pretty curves became wan hollows. White shadows began to show in the black rings of her hair, and the light died out of her eyes. Her features sharpened, and there were pathetic lines at her mouth, which yet wore always an expression of utter sweetness and even happiness. She was devoted to her sister. There was no doubt that she loved her with her whole heart, and was perfectly content in her service. It was her sole anxiety lest she should die and leave her alone. The way Lily Miller used to talk about Luella was enough to make you mad, and enough to make you cry, said Lydia Anderson. I've been in there sometimes, toward the last, when she was too feeble to cook, and carried her some blancmange or custard, something I thought she might relish, and she'd thank me, and when I asked her how she was, say she felt better than she did yesterday, and asked me if I didn't think she looked better, dreadful pitiful, and say poor Luella had an awful time taking care of her and doing the work. She wasn't strong enough to do any. When all the time Luella wasn't lifting her finger, and poor Lily didn't get any care except what the neighbours gave her, and Luella eat up everything that was carried in for Lily. I had it real straight that she did. Luella used to just sit and cry and do nothing. She did act real fond of Lily, and she pined away considerable too. There was those that thought she'd go into a decline herself, but after Lily died, her Aunt Abby Mixter came, and then Luella picked up and grew as fat and rosy as ever. But poor Aunt Abby begun to droop just the way Lily had, and I guess somebody wrote to her married daughter, Mrs. Sam Abbott, who lived in Barry, for she wrote her mother that she must leave right away and come and make her a visit. But Aunt Abby wouldn't go. I can see her now. She was a real good-looking woman, tall and large, with a big square face and a high forehead that looked of itself kind of benevolent and good. She just tended out on Luella as if she had been a baby, and when her married daughter sent for her, she wouldn't stir 1 inch. She'd always thought a lot of her daughter, too, but she said Luella needed her, and her married daughter didn't. Her daughter kept writing and writing, but it didn't do any good. Finally she came, and when she saw how bad her mother looked, she broke down and cried, and all but went on her knees to have her come away. She spoke her mind out to Luella, too. She told her that she'd killed her husband, and everybody that had anything to do with her, and she'd thank her to leave her mother alone. Luella went into hysterics, and Aunt Abby was so frightened that she called me after her daughter went. Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went away fairly crying out loud in the buggy. The neighbours heard her, and well she might, for she never saw her mother again alive. I went in that night when Aunt Abby called for me, standing in the door with her little green check shawl over her head. I can see her now. "Do come over here, Miss Anderson," she sung out, kind of gasping for breath. I didn't stop for any. I put over as fast as I could, and when I got there was Luella laughing and crying all together, and Aunt Abby trying to hush her, and all the time she herself was white as a sheet and shaking so she could hardly stand. "For the land's sakes, Mrs. Mixter," says I, "you look worse than she does. You ain't fit to be up out of your bed." "Oh, there ain't anything the matter with me," says she. Then she went on talking to Luella. There, don't. Don't, poor little lamb," says she. "Aunt Abby is here. She ain't going away and leave you. Don't, poor little lamb." "Do leave her with me, Mrs. Mixter, and you get back to bed," says I, for Aunt Abby had been laying down considerable lately, though somehow she contrived to do the work. "I'm well enough," says she. "Don't you think she had better have the doctor, Miss Anderson?" "The doctor," says I think you had better have the doctor. I think you need him much worse than some folks I could mention." And I looked right straight at Luella Miller, laughing and crying and going on as if she was the center of all creation. All the time she was acting so. Seemed as if she was too sick to sense any. She was keeping a sharp lookout as to how we took it out of the corner of one eye. I see her. You could never cheat me about Luella Miller. Finally I got real mad, and I run home, and I got a bottle of valerian I had, and I poured some boiling hot water on a handful of catnip, and I mixed up that catnip tea with most half a wine-glass of valerian, and I went with it over to Luella's. I marched right up to Luella, holding out of that cup, all smoking. "Now," says I, "Luella Miller, you swallow this. What is it? Oh, what is it?" she sort of screeches out. Then she goes off a-laughing enough to kill. "Poor lamb, poor little lamb," says Aunt Abby, standing over her, all kind of tottery, and trying to bathe her head with camphor. "You swallow this right down," says I. And I didn't waste any ceremony. I just took hold of Luella Miller's chin, and I tipped her head back, and I caught her mouth open with laughing, and I clapped that cup to her lips, and I fairly hollered at her, "Swaller, swaller, swaller." And she gulped it right down. She had to, and I guess it did her good. Anyhow, she stopped crying and laughing, and let me put her to bed, and she went to sleep like a baby inside of half an hour. That was more than poor Aunt Abby did. She lay awake all that night, and I stayed with her, though she tried not to have me, said she wasn't sick enough for watchers. But I stayed, and I made some good cornmeal gruel, and I fed her a teaspoon every little while all night long. It seemed to me as if she was just dying from being all wore out. In the morning, as soon as it was light, I ran over to the Bisbees and sent Johnny Bisbee for the doctor. I told him to tell the doctor to hurry, and he come pretty quick. Poor Aunt Abby didn't seem to know much of anything when he got there. You couldn't hardly tell she breathed, she was so used up. When the doctor had gone, Luella came into the room, looking like a baby in her ruffled nightgown. I can see her now. Her eyes were as blue and her face all pink and white like a blossom, and she looked at Aunt Abby in the bed sort of innocent and surprised. "Why," says she, "Aunt Abby ain't got up yet?" "No, she ain't," says I, pretty short. "I thought I didn't smell the coffee," says Luella. "Coffee?" says I. "I guess if you have coffee this morning you'll make it yourself." "I never made the coffee in all my life," says she, dreadful astonished. "Erastus always made the coffee as long as he lived, and then Lily she made it, and then Aunt Abby made it. I don't believe I can make the coffee, Miss Anderson." "You can make it or go without, just as you please," says I. "Ain't Aunt Abby going to get up?" says she. "I guess she won't get up," says I, sick as she is. I was getting madder and madder. There was something about that little pink and white thing standing there and talking about coffee, when she had killed so many better folks than she was, and had just killed another, that made me feel most as if I wished somebody would up and kill her before she had a chance to do any more harm. "Is Aunt Abby sick?" says Luella, as if she was sort of aggrieved and injured. "Yes," says I, "she's sick, and she's going to die. And then you'll be left alone, and you'll have to do for yourself, and wait on yourself, or do without things." I don't know but I was sort of hard, but it was the truth. and if I was any harder than Luella Miller had been, I'll give up. I ain't never been sorry that I said it. Well, Luella, she up and had hysterics again at that, and I jest let her have 'em. All I did was to bundle her into the room on the other side of the entry, where Aunt Abby couldn't hear her if she wasn't past it. I don't know but she was, and set her down hard in a chair, and told her not to come back into the other room, and she minded. She had her hysterics in there till she got tired. When she found out that nobody was coming to coddle her and do for her, she stopped. At least I suppose she did. I had all I could do with poor Aunt Abby, trying to keep the breath of life in her. The doctor had told me that she was dreadful low, and give me some very strong medicine to give to her in drops real often, and told me real particular about the nourishment. Well, I did as he told me real faithful, till she wasn't able to swallow any longer. Then I had her daughter sent for. I had begun to realize that she wouldn't last any time at all. I hadn't realized it before, though I spoke to Luella the way I did. The doctor, he came, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, but when she got there it was too late. Her mother was dead. Aunt Abby's daughter just give one look at her mother, lay in there, then she turned sort of sharp and sudden and looked at me. "Where is she?" says she, and I knew she meant Luella. "She's out in the kitchen," says I. "She's too nervous to see folks die. She's afraid it will make her sick." The doctor, he speaks up then. He was a young man. Old Dr. Parker died the year before, and this was a young fellow just out of college. "Mrs. Miller is not strong," says he, kind of severe, "and she is quite right in not agitating herself. You, another young man, she's got her pretty claw on you," thinks I, but I didn't say anything to him. I just said over to Mrs. Sam Abbott that Luella was in the kitchen, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went out there, and I went too, and I never heard anything like the way she talked to Luella Miller. I felt pretty hard to Luella myself, but this was more than I ever would have dared to say. Luella, she was too scared to go into hysterics. She jest flopped. She seemed to just shrink away to nothing in that kitchen chair, with Mrs. Sam Abbott standing over her and talking and telling her the truth. I guess the truth was most too much for her, and no mistake, because Luella presently actually did faint away, and there wasn't any sham about it, the way I always suspected there was about them hysterics. She fainted dead away, and we had to lay her flat on the floor. And the doctor, he came running out, and he said something about a weak heart, dreadful fierce, to Mrs. Sam Abbott. But she wasn't a mite scared. She faced him just as white as even Luella was laying there looking like death, and the doctor feeling of her pulse. "Weak heart," says she, "weak heart, weak fiddlesticks. There ain't nothing weak about that woman. She's got strength enough to hang on to other folks till she kills 'em. Weak? It was my poor mother that was weak. This woman killed her as sure as if she had taken a knife to her." But the doctor, he didn't pay much attention. He was bending over Luella, laying there with her yellow hair all streaming, and her pretty pink and white face all pale, and her blue eyes like stars gone out. And he was holding onto her hand and smoothing her forehead, and telling me to get the brandy in Aunt Abby's room. And I was sure as I wanted to be that Luella had got somebody else to hang on to now Aunt Abby was gone. And I thought of poor Erastus Miller, and I sort of pitied the poor young doctor, led away by a pretty face, and I made up my mind I'd see what I could do. I waited till Aunt Abby had been dead and buried about a month, and the doctor was going to see Luella steady, and folks were beginning to talk. Then one evening, when I knew the doctor had been called out of town and wouldn't be round, I went over to Luella's. I found her all dressed up in a blue muslin with white polka dots on it, and her hair curled just as pretty, and there wasn't a young girl in the place could compare with her. There was something about Luella Miller seemed to draw the heart right out of you, but she didn't draw it out of me. She was settin' rocking in the chair by her sitting-room window, and Maria Brown had gone home. Maria Brown had been in to help her, or rather to do the work, for Luella wasn't helped when she didn't do any. Maria Brown was real capable, and she didn't have any ties. She wasn't married and lived alone, so she'd offered. I couldn't see why she should do the work any more than Luella. She wasn't any too strong, but she seemed to think she could, and Luella seemed to think so too. So she went over and did all the work, washed and ironed and baked, while Luella sat and rocked. Maria didn't live long afterward. She began to fade away just the same fashion the others had. Well, she was warned, but she acted real mad when folks said anything. Said Luella was a poor, abused woman, too delicate to help herself, and they'd ought to be ashamed, and if she died helping them that couldn't help themselves, she would. And she did. "I suppose Maria has gone home," says I to Luella, when I had gone in and sat down opposite her. "Yes, Maria went half an hour ago, after she had got supper and washed the dishes," says Luella in her pretty way. "I suppose she has got a lot of work to do in her own house tonight," says I, kind of bitter. But that was all thrown away on Luella Miller. It seemed to her right that other folks that wasn't any better able than she was herself should wait on her, and she couldn't get it through her head that anybody should think it wasn't right. "Yes," says Luella, real sweet and pretty. "Yes, she said she had to do her washing tonight. She has let it go for a fortnight along of coming over here. Why don't she stay home and do her washing, instead of coming over here and doing your work, when you are just as well able, and enough sight more so than she is to do it?" says I. Then Luella, she looked at me like a baby who has a rattle shook at it. She sort of laughed as innocent as you please. "Oh, I can't do the work myself, Miss Anderson," says she. "I never did. Maria has to do it." Then I spoke out. "Has to do it," says I. "Has to do it. She don't have to do it either. Maria Brown has her own home and enough to live on. She ain't beholden to you to come over here and slave for you and kill herself." Luella, she jest, sat and stared at me, for all the world like a doll baby that was so abused that it was coming to life. "Yes," says I, "she's killing herself. She's going to die just the way Erastus did, and Lily, and your Aunt Abby. You're killing her just as you did them. I don't know what there is about you, but you seem to bring a curse," says I. "You kill everybody that is fool enough to care anything about you and do for you." She stared at me and she was pretty pale. "And Maria ain't the only one you're going to kill," says I. "You're going to kill Dr. Malcolm before you're done with him." Then a red color came flaming all over her face. "I ain't going to kill him either," says she, and she began to cry. "Yes, you be," says I. Then I spoke as I had never spoke before. "You see, I felt it on account of Erastus. I told her that she hadn't any business to think of another man after she'd been married to one that had died for her, that she was a dreadful woman, and she was, that's true enough. But sometimes I have wondered lately if she knew it, if she wasn't like a baby with scissors in its hand cutting everybody without knowing what it was doing." Luella, she kept getting paler and paler, and she never took her eyes off my face. There was something awful about the way she looked at me and never spoke one word. After a while I quit talking and I went home. I watched that night, but her lamp went out before 9 o'clock, and when Dr. Malcolm came driving past and sort of slowed up, he see there wasn't any light, and he drove along. I saw her sort of shy out of meeting the next Sunday, too, so he shouldn't go home with her. And I begun to think maybe she did have some conscience after all. It was only a week after that Maria Brown died. Sort of sudden at the last, though everybody had seen it was coming. Well, then there was a good deal of feeling and pretty dark whispers. Folks said the days of witchcraft had come again, and they were pretty shy of Luella. She acted sort of offish to the doctor, and he didn't go there, and there wasn't anybody to do anything for her. I don't know how she did get along. I wouldn't go in there and offer to help her, not because I was afraid of dying like the rest, but I thought she was just as well able to do her own work as I was to do it for her, and I thought it was about time that she did it and stopped killing other folks. But it wasn't very long before folks began to say that Luella herself was going into a decline, just the way her husband and Lily and Aunt Abby and the others had, and I saw myself that she looked pretty bad. I used to see her going past from the store with a bundle as if she could hardly crawl, but I remembered how Erastus used to wait and tend when he couldn't hardly put one foot before the other, and I didn't go out to help her. But at last, one afternoon, I saw the doctor come driving up like mad with his medicine chest, and Mrs. Babbitt came in after supper and said that Luella was real sick. "I'd offer to go in and nurse her," says she, "but I've got my children to consider, and maybe it ain't true what they say, but it's queer how many folks that have done for her have died." I didn't say anything, but I considered how she had been Erastus's wife, and how he had set his eyes by her, and I made up my mind to go in the next morning, unless she was better, and see what I could do. But the next morning I see her at the window, and pretty soon she came stepping out as spry as you please, and a little while afterward Mrs. Babbitt came in and told me that the doctor had got a girl from out of town, a Sarah Jones, to come there, and she said she was pretty sure that the doctor was going to marry Luella. I saw him kiss her in the door that night myself, and I knew it was true. The woman came that afternoon, and the way she flew around was a caution. I don't believe Luella had swept since Maria died. She swept and dusted and washed and ironed. Wet clothes and dusters and carpets were flying over there all day, and every time Luella set her foot out when the doctor wasn't there was that Sarah Jones helping of her up and down the steps as if she hadn't learned to walk. Well, everybody knew that Luella and the doctor were going to be married, but it wasn't long before they began to talk about his looking so poorly, just as they had about the others, and they talked about Sarah Jones too. Well, the doctor did die, and he wanted to be married first so as to leave what little he had to Luella, but he died before the minister could get there, and Sarah Jones died a week afterward. Oh, that wound up everything for Luella Miller. Not another soul in the whole town would lift a finger for her. There got to be a sort of panic. Then she began to droop in good earnest. She used to have to go to the store herself, for Mrs. Babbitt was afraid to let Tommy go for her, and I've seen her going past and stopping every 2 or 3 steps to rest. Well, I stood it as long as I could, but one day I see her coming, with her arms full, and stopping to lean against the Babbitt fence, and I ran out and took her bundles and carried them to her house. Then I went home and never spoke one word to her, though she called after me dreadful, kind of pitiful. Well, that night I was taken sick with a chill, and I was sick as I wanted to be for 2 weeks. Mrs. Babbitt had seen me run out to help Luella, and she came in and told me I was going to die on account of it. I didn't know whether I was or not, but I considered I had done right by Erastus's wife. Those last 2 weeks, Luella, she had a dreadful hard time, I guess. She was pretty sick, and as near as I could make out, nobody dared go near her. I don't know as she was really needing anything very much, for there was enough to eat in her house, and it was warm weather, and she made out to cook a little flour gruel every day, I know, but I guess she had a hard time, she that had been so petted and done for all her life. When I got so I could go out, I went over there one morning. Mrs. Babbitt had just come in to say she hadn't seen any smoke, and she didn't know but it was somebody's duty to go in. But she couldn't help thinking of her children, and I got right up, though I hadn't been out of the house for 2 weeks, and I went in there, and Luella, she was laying on the bed, and she was dying. She lasted all that day and into the night. But I sat there after the new doctor had gone away. Nobody else dared to go there. It was about midnight that I left her for a minute, to run home and get some medicine I had been taken, for I begun to feel rather bad. It was a full moon that night, and just as I started out of my door to cross the street back to Luella's, I stopped short, for I saw something. Lydia Anderson at this juncture always said with a certain defiance that she did not expect to be believed, and then proceeded in a hushed voice. I saw what I saw, and I know I saw it, and I will swear on my deathbed that I saw it. I saw Luella Miller, and Erastus Miller, and Lily, and Aunt Abby, and Maria, and the doctor, and Sarah all going out of her door, and all but Luella shone white in the moonlight, and they were all helping her along till she seemed to fairly fly in the midst of them. Then it all disappeared. I stood a minute with my heart pounding. Then I went over there. I thought of going for Mrs. Babbitt, but I thought she'd be afraid. So I went alone, though I knew what had happened. Luella was laying real peaceful, dead on her bed. This was the story that the old woman, Lydia Anderson, told, but the sequel was told by the people who survived her, and this is the tale which has become folklore in the village. Lydia Anderson died when she was 87. She had continued wonderfully hale and hearty for one of her years, until about 2 weeks before her death. One bright moonlight evening, she was sitting beside a window in her parlour, when she made a sudden exclamation, and was out of the house and across the street before the neighbour who was taking care of her could stop her. She followed as fast as possible, and found Lydia Anderson stretched on the ground before the door of Luella Miller's deserted house, and she was quite dead. The next night there was a red gleam of fire athwart the moonlight, and the old house of Luella Miller was burned to the ground. Nothing is now left of it except a few old cellar stones and a lilac bush, and in summer a helpless trail of morning glories among the weeds, which might be considered emblematic of Luella herself. District School No. 7 stood on the very edge of that wild country which lies west of Arkham. It stood in a little grove of trees, chiefly oaks and elms, with 1 or 2 maples. In one direction the road led to Arkham. In the other it dwindled away into the wild, wooded country which always looms darkly on that western horizon. It presented a warmly attractive appearance to me when first I saw it on my arrival as the new teacher early in September 1920, though it had no distinguishing architectural feature, and was in every respect the replica of thousands of country schools scattered throughout New England. A compact, conservative building, painted white, so that it shone forth from among the trees in the midst of which it stood. It was an old building at that time, and no doubt has since been abandoned or torn down. The school district has now been consolidated, but at that time it supported this school in somewhat niggardly a manner, skimping and saving on every necessity. Its standard readers when I came there to teach were still McGuffey's Eclectic Readers, in editions published before the turn of the century. My charges added up to 27. There were Allens and Wakeleys and Perkinses, Dunlocks and Nabots and Talbots, and there was Andrew Potter. I cannot now recall the precise circumstances of my especial notice of Andrew Potter. He was a large boy for his age, very dark of mien, with haunting eyes and a shock of tousled black hair. His eyes brooded upon me with a kind of different quality which at first challenged me, but ultimately left me strangely uneasy. He was in the 5th grade, and it did not take me long to discover that he could very easily advance into the 7th or 8th, but made no effort to do so. He seemed to have only a casual tolerance for his schoolmates, and for their part they respected him, but not out of affection so much as what struck me soon as fear. Very soon thereafter I began to understand that this strange lad held for me the same kind of amused tolerance that he held for his schoolmates. Perhaps it was inevitable that the challenge of this pupil should lead me to watch him as surreptitiously as I could, and as the circumstances of teaching a one-room school permitted. As a result, I became aware of a vaguely disquieting fact. From time to time, Andrew Potter responded to some stimulus beyond the apprehension of my senses, reacting precisely as if someone had called to him, sitting up, growing alert, and wearing the air of someone listening to sounds beyond my own hearing, in the same attitude assumed by animals hearing sounds beyond the pitch levels of the human ear. My curiosity quickened by this time. I took the first opportunity to ask about him. One of the 8th grade boys, Wilbur Dunlock, was in the habit on occasion of staying after school and helping with the cursory cleaning that the room needed. "Wilbur," I said to him late one afternoon, "I notice you don't seem to pay much attention to Andrew Potter. None of you. Why?" He looked at me a little distrustfully and pondered his answer before he shrugged and replied, "He's not like us." "In what way?" He shook his head. "He don't care if we let him play with us or not. He don't want to." He seemed reluctant to talk, but by dint of repeated questions I drew from him certain spare information. The Potters lived deep in the hills to the west, along an all but abandoned branch of the main road that led through the hills. Their farm stood in a little valley locally known as Witch's Hollow, which Wilbur described as a bad place. There were only 4 of them, Andrew, an older sister, and their parents. They did not mix with other people of the district, not even with the Dunlocks, who were their nearest neighbours, living but half a mile from the school itself, and thus perhaps 4 miles from Witch's Hollow, with woods separating the 2 farms. More than this he could not, or would not, say. About a week later, I asked Andrew Potter to remain after school. He offered no objection, appearing to take my request as a matter of course. As soon as the other children had gone, he came up to my desk and stood there, waiting, his dark eyes fixed expectantly on me, and just the shadow of a smile on his full lips. "I've been studying your grades, Andrew," I said, "and it seems to me that with only a little effort you could skip into the 6th, perhaps even the 7th grade. Wouldn't you like to make that effort?" He shrugged. "What do you intend to do when you get out of school?" He shrugged again. "Are you going to high school in Arkham?" He considered me with eyes that seemed suddenly piercing in their keenness, all lethargy gone. "Mr. Williams, I'm here because there's a law says I have to be," he answered. "There's no law says I have to go to high school." "But aren't you interested?" I pressed him. "What I'm interested in doesn't matter. It's what my folks want that counts." "Well, I'm going to talk to them," I decided on the moment. "Come along, I'll take you home." For a moment something like alarm sprang into his expression, but in seconds it diminished and gave way to that air of watchful lethargy so typical of him. He shrugged and stood waiting while I slipped my books and papers into the school bag I habitually carried. Then he walked docilely to the car with me and got in, looking at me with a smile that could only be described as superior. We rode through the woods in silence, which suited the mood that came upon me as soon as we had entered the hills, for the trees pressed close upon the road, and the deeper we went, the darker grew the wood, perhaps as much because of the lateness of that October day as because of the thickening of the trees. From relatively open glades we plunged into an ancient wood, and when at last we turned down the side road, little more than a lane, to which Andrew silently pointed, I found that I was driving through a growth of very old and strangely deformed trees. I had to proceed with caution. The road was so little used that underbrush crowded upon it from both sides, and oddly I recognized little of it, for all my studies in botany, though once I thought I saw saxifrage, curiously mutated. I drove abruptly, without warning, into the yard before the Potter house. The sun was now lost beyond the wall of trees, and the house stood in a kind of twilight. Beyond it stretched a few fields, strung out up the valley. In one there were corn shocks, in another stubble, in yet another pumpkins. The house itself was forbidding, low to the ground, with half a second-story gambrel-roofed, with shuttered windows, and the outbuildings stood gaunt and stark, looking as if they had never been used. The entire farm looked deserted. The only sign of life was in a few chickens that scratched at the earth behind the house. Had it not been that the lane along which we had travelled ended here, I would have doubted that we had reached the Potter house. Andrew flashed a glance at me, as if he sought some expression on my face to convey to him what I thought. Then he jumped lightly from the car, leaving me to follow. He went into the house ahead of me. I heard him announce me. "Brought the teacher, Mr. Williams." There was no answer. Then, abruptly I was in the room, lit only by an old-fashioned kerosene lamp. And there were the other 3 Potters. The father, a tall, stoop-shouldered man, grizzled and greying, who could not have been more than 40 but looked much older, not so much physically as psychically. The mother, an almost obscenely fat woman, and the girl, slender, tall, and with that same air of watchful waiting that I had noticed in Andrew. Andrew made the brief introductions, and the four of them stood or sat, waiting upon what I had to say, and somewhat uncomfortably suggesting in their attitudes that I say it and get out. "I wanted to talk to you about Andrew," I said. "He shows great promise, and he could be moved up a grade or two if he'd study a little more." My words were not welcomed. "I believe he's smart enough for 8th grade, I went on, and stopped. "If he hasn't 8th grade," said his father, "he'd be having to go to high school before he is old enough to get out of going to school. That's the law. They told me." I could not help thinking of what Wilbur Dunlop had told me of the reclusiveness of the Potters, and as I listened to the elder Potter and thought of what I had heard, I was suddenly aware of a kind of tension among them and a subtle alteration in their attitude. The moment the father stopped talking, there was a singular harmony of attitude. All four of them seemed to be listening to some inner voice, and I doubt that they heard my protest at all. "You can't expect a boy as smart as Andrew just to come back here," I said. "He is good enough," said old Potter. "Besides, he's ours. And don't ye go talking about us now, Mr. Williams." He spoke with so latently menacing an undercurrent in his voice that I was taken aback. At the same time I was increasingly aware of a miasma of hostility, not proceeding so much from any one or all four of them, as from the house and its setting themselves. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be going." I turned and went out, Andrew at my heels. Outside, Andrew said softly, "You shouldn't be talking about us, Mr. Williams. Pa gets mad when he finds out. You talked to Wilbur Dunlop." I was arrested at getting into the car. With one foot on the running board, I turned. "Did he say so?" I asked. He shook his head. "You did, Mr. Williams," he said, and backed away. "It's not what he thinks, but what he might do." Before I could speak again, he had darted into the house. For a moment I stood undecided, but my decision was made for me. Suddenly, in the twilight, the house seemed to burgeon with menace, and all the surrounding woods seemed to stand waiting but to bend upon me. Indeed, I was aware of a rustling, like the whispering of wind in all the wood, though no wind stirred, and from the house itself came a malevolence like the blow of a fist. I got into the car and drove away, with that impression of malignance at my back like the hot breath of a ravaging pursuer. I reached my room in Arkham at last, badly shaken. Seen in retrospect, I had undergone an unsettling psychic experience. There was no other explanation for it. I had the unavoidable conviction that, however blindly, I had thrust myself into far deeper waters than I knew, and the very unexpectedness of the experience made it the more chilling. I could not eat, for the wonder of what went on in that house in Witch's Hollow, of what it was that bound the family together, chaining them to that place, preventing a promising lad like Andrew Potter even from the most fleeting wish to leave that dark valley and go out into a brighter world. I lay for most of that night, sleepless, filled with a nameless dread, for which all explanation eluded me, and when I slept at last, my sleep was filled with hideously disturbing dreams, in which beings far beyond my mundane imagination held the stage, and cataclysmic events of the utmost terror and horror took place. And when I rose next morning, I felt that somehow I had touched upon a world totally alien to my kind. I reached the school early that morning, but Wilbur Dunlop was there before me. His eyes met mine with sad reproach. I could not imagine what had happened to disturb this usually friendly pupil. "You shouldn't have told Andrew Potter we talked about him," he said, with a kind of unhappy resignation. "I didn't, Wilbur. I know I didn't. So you must have," he said. "And then 6 of our cows got killed last night, and the shed where they were was crushed down on him." I was momentarily too startled to reply. "A sudden windstorm," I began, but he cut me off. "Weren't no wind last night, Mr. Williams, and the cows were smashed." "You surely cannot think that the Potters had anything to do with this, Wilbur," I cried. He gave me a weary look, the look of one who knows, meeting the glance of one who should know but cannot understand, and said nothing more. This was even more upsetting than my experience of the previous evening. He at least was convinced that there was a connection between our conversation about the Potter family and the Dunlocks' loss of 6 cows. And he was convinced with so deep a conviction that I knew without trying that nothing I could say would shake it. When Andrew Potter came in, I looked in vain for any sign that anything out of the ordinary had taken place since last I had seen him. Somehow I got through that day. Immediately after the close of the school session, I hastened into Arkham and went to the office of the Arkham Gazette, the editor of which had been kind enough, as a member of the local district board of education, to find my room for me. He was an elderly man, almost 70, and might presumably know what I wanted to find out. My appearance must have conveyed something of my agitation, for when I walked into his office, his eyebrows lifted, and he said, "What's got your dander up, Mr. Williams?" I made some attempt to dissemble, since I could put my hand upon nothing tangible, and, viewed in the cold light of day, what I might have said would have sounded almost hysterical to an impartial listener. I said only, "I'd like to know something about a Potter family that lives in Witch's Hollow, west of the school." He gave me an enigmatic glance. "Never heard of old Wizard Potter?" he asked, and before I could answer, he went on, "No, of course, you're from Brattleboro. We could hardly expect Vermonters to know about what goes on in the Massachusetts back country. He lived there first, an old man when I first knew him, and these Potters were distant relatives, lived in Upper Michigan, inherited the property and came to live there when Wizard Potter died. But what do you know about them?" I persisted. "Nothing but what everybody else knows," he said. "When they came, they were nice friendly people. Now they talk to nobody, seldom come out, and there's all that talk about missing animals from the farms in the district. The people tie that all up." Thus begun, I questioned him at length. I listened to a bewildering enigma of half-told tales, hints, legends and lore utterly beyond my comprehension. What seemed to be incontrovertible was a distant cousinship between Wizard Potter and one Wizard Whately of nearby Dunwich. A bad lot, the editor called him, the solitary way of life of old Wizard Potter, and the incredible length of time he had lived, the fact that people generally shunned Witch's Hollow. What seemed to be sheer fantasy was the superstitious lore, that Wizard Potter had called something down from the sky, and it lived with him or in him until he died, that a late traveller, found in a dying state along the main road, had gasped out something about that thing with the feelers, slimy, rubbery thing with the suckers on its feelers, that came out of the woods and attacked him, and a good deal more of the same kind of lore. When he finished, the editor scribbled a note to the librarian at Miskatonic University in Arkham and handed it to me. "Tell him to let you look at that book. You may learn something," he shrugged, "and you may not. Young people nowadays take the world with a lot of salt." I went supperless to pursue my search for the special knowledge I felt I needed, if I were to save Andrew Potter for a better life. For it was this, rather than the satisfaction of my curiosity, that impelled me. I made my way to the library of Miskatonic University, looked up the librarian, and handed him the editor's note. The old man gave me a sharp look, said, "Wait here, Mr. Williams," and went off with a ring of keys. So the book, whatever it was kept under lock and key. I waited for what seemed an interminable time. I was now beginning to feel some hunger, and to question my unseemly haste. And yet I felt that there was little time to be lost, though I could not define the catastrophe I hoped to avert. Finally the librarian came, bearing an ancient tome, and brought it around, and to a table within his range of vision. The book's title was in Latin, Necronomicon, though its author was evidently an Arabian, Abdul al-Hazred, and its text was in somewhat archaic English. I began to read with interest, which soon turned to complete bewilderment. The book evidently concerned ancient alien races, invaders of Earth, great mythical beings called Ancient Ones and Elder Gods, with outlandish names like Cthulhu and Hastur, Shub, Niggurath and Azathoth, Dagon and Ithaqua and Wendigo and Cthugha, all involved in some kind of plan to dominate Earth, and served by some of its peoples, the Tocho and the Deep Ones, and others. It was a book filled with Kabbalistic lore, incantations, and what purported to be an account of a great interplanetary battle between the elder gods and the ancient ones, and of the survival of cults and servitors in isolated and remote places on our planet, as well as on sister planets. What this rigmarole had to do with my immediate problem, with the ingrown and strange Potter family and their longing for solitude, and their anti-social way of life, was completely beyond me. How long I would have gone on reading, I do not know. I was interrupted presently by the awareness of being studied by a stranger, who stood not far from me with his eyes moving from the book I was busy reading to me. Having caught my eye, he made so bold as to come over to my side. "Forgive me," he said, "but what in this book interests a country school teacher?" "I wonder now myself," I said. He introduced himself as Professor Martin Keene. "I may say, sir," he added, "that I know this book practically by heart. A farrago of superstition. Do you think so?" "Emphatically. You have lost the quality of wonder, Mr. Williams. Tell me, if you will, what brought you to this book?" I hesitated, but Professor Keene's personality was persuasive and inspired confidence. "Let us walk, if you don't mind," I said. He nodded. I returned the book to the librarian and joined my newfound friend. Haltingly, as clearly as I could, I told him about Andrew Potter, the house in Witch's Hollow, my strange psychic experience, even the curious coincidence of Dunlock's cows. To all this he listened without interruption, indeed, with a singular absorption. I explained at last that my motive in looking into the background of Witch's Hollow was solely to do something for my pupil. "A little research," he said, "would have informed you that many strange events have taken place in such remote places as Dunwich and Innsmouth. Even Arkham and Witch's Hollow," he said, when I had finished. "Look around you at these ancient houses with their shuttered rooms and ill-lit fanlights. How many strange events have taken place under those gambrel roofs? We shall never know. But let us put aside the question of belief. One may not need to see the embodiment of evil to believe in it, Mr. Williams. I should like to be of some small service to the boy in this matter. May I? By all means. It may be perilous to you as well as to him. I am not concerned about myself, but I assure you it cannot be any more perilous to the boy than his present position. Even death for him is less perilous." "You speak in riddles, Professor." "Let it be better so, Mr. Williams. But come, we are at my residence. Pray come in." We went into one of those ancient houses of which Professor Keene had spoken. I walked into the musty past, for the rooms were filled with books and all manner of antiquities. My host took me into what was evidently his sitting room, swept a chair clear of books, and invited me to wait while he busied himself on the second floor. He was not, however, gone very long, not even long enough for me to assimilate the curious atmosphere of the room in which I waited. When he came back, he carried what I saw at once were objects of stone, roughly in the shape of 5 pointed stars. He put 5 of them into my hands. "Tomorrow, after school, if the Potter boy is there, you must contrive to touch him with one of these and keep it fixed upon him," said my host. "There are 2 other conditions. You must keep one of these at least on your person at all times, and you must keep all thought of the stone and what you are about to do out of your mind. These beings have a telepathic sense, an ability to read your thoughts. Startled, I recalled Andrew's charging me with having talked about them with Wilbur Dunlock. "Should I not know what these are?" I asked. "If you can abate your doubts for the time being," my host answered, with a grim smile. "These stones are among the thousands bearing the Sea of Relay which closed the prisons of the Ancient Ones. They are the seals of the elder gods." "Professor Keene, the age of superstition is past," I protested. "Mr. Williams, the wonder of life and its mysteries is never past," he retorted. "If the stone has no meaning, it has no power. If it has no power, it cannot affect young Potter, and it cannot protect you." "From what?" "From the power behind the malignance you felt at the house in Witch's Hollow," he answered. "Or was this too superstition?" He smiled. "You need not answer. I know your answer. If something happens when you put the stone upon the boy, he cannot be allowed to go back home. You must bring him here to me. Are you agreed?" Agreed, I answered. That next day was interminable, not only because of the imminence of crisis, but because it was extremely difficult to keep my mind blank before the inquiring gaze of Andrew Potter. Moreover, I was conscious as never before of the wall of pulsing malignance at my back, emanating from the wild country mere, a tangible menace hidden in a pocket of the dark hills. But the hours passed, however slowly, and just before dismissal I asked Andrew Potter to wait after the others had gone. And again he assented, with that casual air tantamount almost to insolence, so that I was compelled to ask myself whether he were worth saving, as I thought of saving him in the depths of my mind. But I persevered. I had hidden the stone in my car, and, once the others were gone, I asked Andrew to step outside with me. At this point I felt both helpless and absurd. I, a college graduate, about to attempt what for me seemed inevitably the kind of mumbo-jumbo that belonged to the African wilderness. And for a few moments, as I walked stiffly from the schoolhouse toward the car, I almost flagged, almost simply invited Andrew to get into the car to be driven home. But I did not. I reached the car with Andrew at my heels, reached in, seized a stone to slip into my own pocket, seized another, and turned with lightning rapidity to press the stone to Andrew's forehead. Whatever I expected to happen, it was not what took place. For, at the touch of the stone, an expression of the utmost horror shone in Andrew Potter's eyes. In a trice, this gave way to poignant anguish. A great cry of terror burst from his lips. He flung his arms wide, scattering his books, wheeled as far as he could with my hold upon him, shuddered, and would have fallen had I not caught him and lowered him, foaming at the mouth, to the ground. And then I was conscious of a great cold wind which whirled about us and was gone, bending the grasses and the flowers, rippling the edge of the wood, and tearing away the leaves at the outer band of trees. Driven by my own terror, I lifted Andrew Potter into the car, laid the stone on his chest, and drove as fast as I could into Arkham, 7 miles away. Professor Keene was waiting, no whit surprised at my coming, and he had expected that I would bring Andrew Potter, for he had made a bed ready for him, and together we put him into it, after which Keene administered a sedative. Then he turned to me. "Now then, there's no time to be lost. They'll come to look for him, the girl probably first. We must get back to the schoolhouse at once." But now the full meaning and horror of what had happened to Andrew Potter had dawned upon me, and I was so shaken that it was necessary for Keene to push me from the room and half drag me out of the house. And again, as I set down these words so long after the terrible events of that night, I find myself trembling with that apprehension and fear which seize hold of a man who comes for the first time face to face with the vast unknown, and knows how puny and meaningless he is against that cosmic immensity. I knew in that moment that what I had read in that forbidden book at the Miskatonic Library was not a farrago of superstition, but the key to a hitherto unsuspected revelation, perhaps far, far older than mankind in the universe. I did not dare to think of what Wizard Potter had called down from the sky. I hardly heard Professor Keene's words as he urged me to discard my emotional reaction and think of what had happened in scientific, more clinical fashion. After all, I had now accomplished my objective. Andrew Potter was saved, but to ensure it, he must be made free of the others, who would surely follow him and find him. I thought only of what waiting horror that quartet of country people from Michigan had walked into when they came to take up possession of the solitary farm in Witch's Hollow. I drove blindly back to school. There, at Professor Keene's behest, I put on the lights and sat with the door open to the warm night, while he concealed himself behind the building to wait upon their coming. I had to steel myself in order to blank out my mind and take up that vigil. On the edge of night the girl came, and after she had undergone the same experience as her brother and lay beside the desk, the star-shaped stone on her breast, their father showed up in the doorway. All was darkness now, and he carried a gun. He had no need to ask what had happened. He knew. He stood, wordless, pointed to his daughter and the stone on her breast, and raised his gun. His inference was plain. If I did not remove the stone, he meant to shoot. Evidently this was the contingency the professor expected, for he came upon Potter from the rear and touched him with the stone. Afterward we waited for 2 hours. In vain for Mrs. Potter. "She isn't coming," said Professor Keen at last. "She harbours the seat of its intelligence." "I had thought it would be the man." "Very well. We have no choice. We must go to Witch's Hollow. These two can be left here." We drove through the darkness, making no attempt at secrecy, for the professor said the thing in the house in the hollow knew we were coming, but could not reach us past the talisman of the stone. We went through that close pressing forest, down the narrow lane where the queer undergrowth seemed to reach out toward us in the glow of the headlights, into the Potter yard. The house stood dark, save for a wan glow of lamplight in one room. Professor Keen leapt from the car with his little bag of star-shaped stones and went around sealing the house, with a stone at each of the 2 doors and one at each of the windows, through one of which we could see the woman sitting at the kitchen table, stolid, watchful, aware, no longer dissembling, looking unlike that tittering woman I had seen in this house not long ago, but rather like some great sentient beast at bay. When he had finished, my companion went round to the front, and by means of brush collected from the yard and piled against the door, set fire to the house, heedless of my protests. Then he went back to the window to watch the woman, explaining that only fire could destroy the elemental force, but that he hoped still to save Mrs. Potter. "Perhaps you'd better not watch, Williams." I did not heed him. Would that I had, and so spared myself the dreams that invade my sleep even yet. I stood at the window behind him and watched what went on in that room, for the smell of smoke was now permeating the house. Mrs. Potter, or what animated her gross body, started up, went awkwardly to the back door, retreated to the window, retreated from it, and came back to the centre of the room, between the table and the wood stove not yet fired against the coming cold. There she fell to the floor, heaving and writhing. The room filled slowly with smoke, hazing about the yellow lamp, making the room indistinct, but not indistinct enough to conceal completely what went on in the course of that terrible struggle on the floor, where Mrs. Potter threshed about as if in mortal convulsion, and slowly, half-visibly, something other took shape. An incredible amorphous mass, only half-glimpsed in the smoke, tentacled, shimmering, with a cold intelligence and a physical coldness that I could feel through the window. The thing rose like a cloud above the now motionless body of Mrs. Potter, and then fell upon the stove and drained into it like vapour. "The stove!" cried Professor Kane, and fell back. Above us, out of the chimney, came a spreading blackness, like smoke, gathering itself briefly there. Then it hurtled like a lightning bolt aloft into the stars, in the direction of the Hyades, back to that place from which old wizard Potter had called it into himself, away from where it had lain in wait for the Potters to come from Upper Michigan, and afforded new host on the face of earth. We managed to get Mrs. Potter out of the house, much shrunken now, but alive. On the remainder of that night's events there is no need to dwell. How the professor waited until fire had consumed the house to collect his store of star-shaped stones, of the reuniting of the Potter family, freed from the curse of Witch's Hollow, and determined never to return to that haunted valley, of Andrew, who, when we came to waken him, was talking in his sleep of great winds that fought and tore, and a place by the Lake of Marley where they live in glory forever. What it was that old wizard Potter had called down from the stars, I lacked the courage to ask, but I knew that it touched upon secrets better left unknown to the races of men. Secrets I would never have become aware of had I not chanced to take District School No. 7, and had among my pupils the strange boy who was Andrew Potter. The quarrel between Mayor Tyrelou and my young friend Philippe Ade grew out of the fact that he had fallen in love with Maguelon, the old woman's granddaughter. Although Maguelon was past 19 and by far the prettiest girl in the village, she had no suitors among the local youths. The native peasants of Les Baux, this savage mountain hamlet in the south of France, which I had been visiting at intervals for years, were steeped in superstition, and believed that old Mère Tirelou was a sorcière, a sort of witch. Maguelone, orphaned by the war, lived alone with the old woman in an ancient tumble-down stone mast, somewhat isolated from the village proper among the ruins of the seigneurial castle close above it. Gossip whispered that Mère Tirelou had involved the girl, willingly or unwillingly, in her dark practices. They were not persecuted or hated. In fact, the peasants and shepherds of Les Baux and the surrounding mountainside sometimes consulted Mère Tirelou in certain emergencies. But, save for such special consultations, paid for usually with a rabbit, a jug of wine, or a bottle of oil, the old beldam and her granddaughter, apprentice, if such she really was, were generally avoided, if not actually disliked and feared. Philippe, however, who considered himself now of the great world, having been to technical school in Marseille and worked in an aeroplane plant at Toulon, regarded all this local superstition and stuff as nonsense. He had come up vacationing from Toulon on his motorcycle. We had known each other at Les Baux the previous summer, and we were staying at the same little hotel, the Hôtel René, perched on the edge of the cliff and run by Philippe's aunt, Madame Plaume, and her husband Martine. And Philippe, as I have said, had fallen in love with Maguelone. This was the situation, briefly outlined, when the strange series of events began, which first involved me only as a chance onlooker, but finally as an active participant. They began one hot mid-afternoon when I lay reading in my room, which was in an angle of the wall with windows overlooking the valley, and a side window immediately above the medieval rampart gate, from which the road serpentined downward. Close beneath this window, all at once, I heard and recognized Mère Tirelou's querulous, croaking voice raised angrily, and Philippe's in reply, half amiable, half derisive. It was hazard rather than eavesdropping, impossible not to hear them, and then, after some muttering, the old woman raised her voice again, but this time in such a curious, unnatural tone that I got up to see what was occurring. They were standing in the sunshine just beneath the window, he tall, blondish, ruddy, tousled-hayed, bareheaded, in knickers and sports shirt, she grey, bent and hawk-like, bat-like, rather, in her Arlesienne coiffée and cloak, with arms outstretched barring his path. And she was intoning a weird, sing-song doggerel, at the same time weaving in the air with her claw-like hands. Go down, my pretty youth, but you will not come up again. Tangled foot will twist and turn, and tangled brain will follow. You will go down, my pretty one, but you will not come up again. So tangle, twist and turn, cobwebs and spider-webs are woven. She was now no longer barring Felipe's path, but standing aside, inviting him to pass, so that her back was turned to me, while Philippe stood so that I could see his face and the expressions which flitted over it. First an interested, incredulous surprise, as if he couldn't believe his own ears. Then a good-humoured but derisive and defiant grin, as the old woman repeated her doggerel. "Oh no, Mère Tirelou," he said, laughing, "you can't scare me off with stuff like that. Better get a broomstick if you want to drive me away. Save your cobwebs and incantations for Bleu and the shepherds." So, with a defiant gay salute and an au revoir, he was off down the road whistling, while the old woman screamed after him, "Down, down, down you go, but not up, my pretty boy, not up, not up, not up." I watched Philippe descending the winding road into the valley, while Mère Tirelou, leaning over the parapet, watched him too, until he became a tiny figure far below, and disappeared behind the orchard wall which skirts the road by the pavilion of the Reine Jeanne. Then she picked up her stick, called Bleu her dog, and hobbled in through the gate. So, thought I, that old woman really believes herself a witch, and probably thinks she has put an effective curse on Philippe. But it didn't occur to me to be in the least disturbed. I knew, or thought I knew, a good deal about witchcraft, technically. I believed it all reduced finally to suggestion and autosuggestion, I had known it to produce tangible results, but only in cases when the victim himself, usually among primitives or savages, was deeply superstitious and consequently amenable to fear. I felt absolutely sure that complete, hard-headed, skeptical disbelief, derision, laughter, constituted a stronger counter-magic than any amount of exorcism or holy water, and therefore it did not occur to me for an instant that Philippe could be in the slightest danger. Holding these convictions, and therefore regarding the safe return of Philippe as a foregone conclusion, I thought little more of the matter that afternoon. Finished my reading, dined early, strolled to the top of the cliff to watch the sunset, and went early to bed. Usually, after 10 o'clock at night, the whole village of Les Baux, including the interior of the Hotel René, is sound asleep and as silent as the grave. It was the noise of hurrying footsteps clattering along the stone floor of the hotel corridor which awoke me late in the night, but at the same time I heard lowered voices in the road beneath my window, saw lights flashing, and heard sabots clacking along the cobbled street. I struck a light, saw that it was shortly past midnight, dressed, and went downstairs. Martin Plom was talking to a group of neighbours. His wife was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a quilted dressing gown. "What has happened?" I asked her. "We are worried about Philippe," she replied. "He went for a walk this afternoon down in the valley, and he hasn't returned. They are going to search for him. We thought nothing of it, that he didn't come back for dinner, but it is now past midnight, and we are afraid he may have had an accident." Already the men, in groups of 2 or 3, some with old-fashioned farm lanterns, a few with electric flashlights, were starting down the mountainside. I joined Martin Plom, who was at the gate, instructing them to go this way or that, and to keep in touch with one another by shouting. He himself was going to search upward on the other slope, toward the Grotte des Filles, where Philippe sometimes climbed, fearing that he might have fallen down a ravine. I went along with him. It was just before dawn, after hours of fruitless search, that we heard a different shouting from the head of the valley. I could not distinguish the words, but Martin immediately said, "They've found him." We worked our way across and climbed toward the road, along which we now could see lights flashing, returning toward Les Baux. They were carrying Philippe on an improvised litter, made with 2 saplings and pine branches, interwoven. He was conscious, his eyes were open, but he seemed to be in a stupor, and had been unable, they said, to explain what had happened to him. No bones were broken, nor had he suffered any other serious physical injury, but his clothes were torn, particularly the knees of his knickerbockers, which were ripped and abraded as if he had been dragging himself along on hands and knees. They all agreed on what had probably happened. He had been climbing bareheaded among the rocks in the heat of the late afternoon, suffered an insolation, a prostrating but not fatal sunstroke, had partially recovered, and, in seeking help, still delirious, had lost his way. He should be all right in a day or 2, Martin said. They would have a doctor up from Arles in the morning. Of course, I had thought more than once that night about Mère Turulu, and had considered mentioning the matter to Martin Plum, but this explanation was so reasonable, adequate, natural, that it seemed to me absurd then to view the episode as anything more than pure coincidence, so I said nothing. It was dawn when we reached Les Baux and got Philippe to bed, and when I awoke toward noon, the doctor had already come and gone. He had a bad stroke, Martin told me. His head is clear, but there's still something the doctor couldn't understand. When Philippe tried to get up from the bed, he couldn't walk. Yet his legs aren't injured. It's queer. We are afraid it may be something like paralysis. He seemed to twist and stumble over his own feet. Sharply as he spoke, the belated certainty came to me that here was an end to all coincidence, that I had been wrong, that something as sinister and darkly evil as I had ever known in the jungle had been happening here in Les Baux, under my very eyes. "Martin," I said, "something occurred yesterday afternoon which you do not know about. I am not prepared to say yet what it was, but I must see Philippe at once and talk with him. You say his mind is perfectly clear?" "Surely," said Martin, puzzled, "though I can't understand what you're driving at. He will want to see you?" Philippe was in bed. He looked depressed rather than ill, and was certainly in complete possession of his senses. I said, "Philippe, Martin tells me there is something wrong with your legs." I think perhaps I can tell you what. Were you ever a doctor? He interrupted eagerly. If we'd known that, the fellow who came up from Arles didn't seem to be much good. No, I'm not a doctor, but I'm not sure this is a doctor's job. I want to tell you something. You know where my room is? I happened to be at the window yesterday, and I heard and saw everything that occurred between you and Mère Terrelou. Haven't you thought that there may be some connection? He stared at me in surprise, and also with a sort of angry disappointment. Tiens, he said, you, an educated modern American, you believe in that fantastic foolishness. Why, I came from these mountains. I was born here, and yet I know that stuff is silly nonsense. I've thought about it, of course, but it doesn't make any sense. How could it? Maybe it doesn't, I said. But just the same, will you please tell me as well as you can remember what happened to you yesterday afternoon and last night? Confound it, you know what happened. I had a stroke, and it has left me like this. Lord, I'd rather be dead than crippled or helpless. He lapsed into sombre silence. But I had heard enough. There are people who have lain paralyzed in bed for life, through no organic ailment, but only because they believed they couldn't arise and walk. If I helped him now, it could be only by overwhelming proof. My business was with Mère Terrelou. Neither the old woman nor her granddaughter had been near the hotel that morning. I climbed the winding, cobbled street and tapped at their door. Presently Maguelone reluctantly opened. I made no effort to enter, but said, "I've come to see Mère Terrelou about a serious matter." She looked at me with worried, guarded eyes, as if uncertain how to answer, and finally said, "She is not here. She went over the mountain last night, beyond Saint-Remy. She will be gone several days." Sensing my doubt, she added defensively, almost pleadingly, "You can come in and see if you wish. She is not here." The girl was obviously in great distress, and I realized that she knew or suspected why I had come. "In that case," I said, "we must talk." "Shall it be like this, or would you prefer to have me come in?" She motioned me inside. I said, "Mademoiselle Maguelone, I beg you to be honest with me. You know what people say about your grandmother, and there are some who say it also about you. I hope that part isn't true. But your grandmother has done something which I am determined to have undone. I am so certain of what I know that, if necessary, I'm going to take Martin Plom into my confidence and go with him to the police at Arles. I feel that you know exactly what I am talking about. It's Philippe, and I want to ask if you—" "No, no, no," the girl cried pitifully, interrupting. "I had nothing to do with it. I tried to stop it. I warned him. I begged him not to see me any more. I told him that something dreadful would happen, but he only laughed at me. He doesn't believe in such things. I have helped my grandmother in other things. She has forced me to help her, but never in anything so wicked as this, and against Philippe. No, no, monsieur, never would I help in such a thing, not even if she—" Suddenly the girl began to sob. "Oh, what ought I to do?" I said, "Do you mean there is something you could do?" "I am afraid," she said. "Afraid of my grandmother. Oh, if you knew. I don't dare go in there, and besides, the door is locked, and it may not be in there." "Maguelone," I said gently, "I think you care for Philippe, and I think he cares for you. Do you know that he has lost the use of his legs?" "Oh!" she sobbed. Then she gathered courage and said, "Yes, I will do it, even if my grandmother kills me. But you must find something to force the lock, for she always carries the key with her." She led me to the kitchen, which was at the rear, built into the side of the cliff, almost beneath the walls of the old castle ruins. While she was lighting a lamp, I found a small hatchet. "It is through there," she said, pointing to a closet whose entrance was covered by a drawn curtain. At the back of the closet, hidden by some old clothes hung on nails, was a small door, locked. It was made of heavy wood, but I had little difficulty forcing the lock and opening the door to disclose a narrow flight of steps winding downward into the darkness. There was nothing mysterious in the fact that such a stairway should exist there. The whole side of the cliff beneath the castle was honeycombed with similar passages. The girl went first, and I followed close behind, lighting our way with the lamp held at her shoulder. The short stairway curved sharply downward, then emerged directly into an old, forgotten rectangular chamber, which at one time must have been a wine cellar or storeroom of the castle. But it now housed various strange and unpleasant objects, on which the shadows flickered as I set the lamp in a niche and began to look about me. I had known that actual witches, practicing almost in the direct medieval tradition, still existed in certain parts of Europe. Yet I was surprised to see the definite material paraphernalia of the craft so literally surviving. No need to describe all of it minutely. The place was evil, and many of the objects were grotesquely so. Against the opposite wall, an altar surmounted by a pair of horns. Beneath them, Inri, reversed with the letters distorted into obscene symbols. Dangling nearby, a black, shriveled hand of glory. And there on the floor, cunningly contrived with infinite pains, covering a considerable space, was the thing which we had come to find, and which, for all my efforts to rationalize, sent a shiver through me as I examined it. 4 upright wooden pegs had been set in the floor, like miniature posts, making a square field about 5 feet in diameter, surrounded by cords which ran from peg to peg. Within this area, and attached to the surrounding cords, was stretched a crisscross, labyrinthine, spiderweb-like maze of cotton thread. Tangled in its centre, like an insect caught in a web, was a figure some 8 inches high. A common doll it had been, with a china head sewn on its stuffed sawdust body. A doll such as might be bought for 3 francs in any toy shop. But whatever baby dress it may have worn when it was purchased had been removed, and a costume, crudely suggesting a man's knickerbocker sport garb, had been substituted in its place. The eyes of this mannequin were bandaged with a narrow strip of black cloth. Its feet and legs tangled, fastened, enmeshed in the criss-cross maze of thread. It slumped, sagging there at an ugly angle, neither upright nor fallen, grotesquely sinister, like the body of a wounded man caught in barbed wire. All this may seem perhaps silly, even childish in the telling, but it was not childish. It was vicious, wicked. I disentangled that mannequin gently and examined it carefully to see whether the body had been pierced with pins or needles, but there were none. The old woman had at least stopped short of attempted murder, and then Maguelon held it to her breast, sobbing, "Ah, Philippe!" I picked up the lamp, and we prepared to come away. The place, however, contained one other object which I have not yet mentioned, and which I now examined more closely. Suspended by a heavy chain from the ceiling was a life-sized, open, cage-like contrivance of wood and blackened leather straps and iron. As perversely devilish a device as twisted human ingenuity ever invented. For I knew its name and use from old engravings in books dealing with the obscure sadistic element in medieval sorcery. It was a witch's cradle, and there was something about the straps that made me wonder. Maguelon saw me studying it and shuddered. "Mademoiselle," I said, "is it possible?" "Yes," she answered, hanging her head. "Since you have been here, there is nothing more to conceal. But it has always been on my part, unwillingly. But why on earth haven't you denounced her? Why haven't you left her?" "Monsieur," she said, "I have been afraid of what I knew. And where would I go? And besides, she is my grandmother." I was alone with Philippe in his bedroom. I had brought the mannequin with me, wrapped in a bit of newspaper. If this were fiction, I should have found him magically cured from the moment the threads were disentangled. But magic in reality operates by more devious processes. He was exactly as I had left him, even more depressed. I told him what I had discovered. He was at the same time skeptical, incredulous, and interested. And when I showed him the mannequin, crudely dressed to represent himself, and it became clear to him that mere Tiraloo had deliberately sought to do him a wicked injury, he grew angry, raised up from his pillows, and exclaimed, "Ah, the old hag! She really meant to harm me." I judged that the moment had come. I stood up. I said, "Philippe, forget all this now. Forget all of it and get up. There is only one thing necessary. Believe that you can walk, and you will walk." He stared at me helplessly, sank back, and said, "I do not believe it." I had failed. His mind lacked, I think, the necessary conscious imagination. But there was one more thing to try. I said gently, "Philippe, you care for Mademoiselle Maguelon, do you not? "I love Maguelon," he replied. And then I told him brutally, briefly, almost viciously, of the thing that hung there in that cellar, and of its use. The effect was as violent, as physical, as if I had suddenly struck him in the face. Ah, God damn it, the naughty woman, the nasty, naughty woman, he shouted, leaping from his bed like a crazy man. The rest was simple. Philippe was too angry and concerned about Maguelon to have much time for surprise or even gratitude at his sudden complete recovery, but he was sensible enough to realize that for the girl's sake it was better not to make a public row. So when he went to fetch Maguelon away, he took his aunt with him, and within the hour she was transferred with her belongings to Madame Plom's room. Martin Plom would deal effectively with old Mère Talleyrand. He was to make no accusation concerning the part she had played in Philippe's misadventure, an issue difficult of legal proof, but to warn her that if she ever tried to interfere with Maguelon or the impending marriage, he would swear out a criminal warrant against her for ill-treatment of a minor ward. There remain two unsolved elements in this case which require an attempted explanation. The belief which I have always held concerning malevolent magic is that it operates by imposed autosuggestion, and that therefore no incantation can work evil, unless the intended victim believes it can. In this case, which seemed to contradict that thesis, I can only suppose that while Philippe's conscious mind reacted with complete skepticism, his unconscious mind, his family came from these same mountains, retained certain atavistic superstitious fears which rendered him vulnerable. The second element is, of course, the elaborate mummery of the enmeshed mannequin, the doll, cousin to the waxen images which in the Middle Ages were pierced with needles or slowly melted before a fire. The witch herself, if not a charlatan, implicitly believes that there is a literal, supernatural transference of identities. My own belief is that the image serves simply as a focus for the concentrated, malevolent willpower of the witch. I hold, in short, that sorcery is a real and dangerous force, but that its ultimate explanation lies not in any supernatural realm, but rather in the field of pathological psychology. The logs just placed on the fire were damp, and as the powerful yellow flames enveloped them, long, hissing jets of steam broke the silence. At the table, covered with wine bottles, glasses, and candles, sat 4 men. They were conspirators. They had met in the interest of the exiled Stuart king, James III, the Pretender, as the current government called him. The 4 were the curate, King James' messenger, the scribe Gartshaw, and old Jem Lamberdiston, the lord of the manor. Gartshaw was considering a financial matter, for which the others were waiting for an answer. Finally he said, "Not much more than £5,000. Tell His Majesty 5,000 guineas." The messenger took note, and that concluded the matter for that evening. Now the curé was eager to leave. He did not feel comfortable in old Jem's house. Only the presence of the steward's messenger had drawn him across the threshold. For not only had he and old Jem quarrelled violently in the early days of their acquaintance, about 18 months earlier, and had rarely spoken to each other since, but old Jem was said to have been a very wicked man during his life, and now, at 87, he was always ready to mock the good, to speak with satisfaction of his own misdeeds, and to approve those of others. The only spark in his soul that did not shine with an evil glow, so it was said around, concerned the sincere wish that James III could be installed on his father's throne. That evening old Jem had been completely absorbed in the problems of exile, but once the appropriate decisions had been made, it was not unlikely that his tongue would turn maliciously to themes and assertions that would deeply wound the cure. At least, so the clergyman believed, and his ears were on the alert as he hesitated between staying and taking leave, proving in this case rude to the company. In any case, old Jem was rather silent. Sinking into his chair, he watched the messenger folding his papers. After a while he motioned for him to refill his glass. Emptying his own, he blinked and closed his eyes, breathing heavily. The curé, though caught up in a discussion with Gartshaw, looked at his guest. Try as he might, he could feel no motion of that pity which old men so often arouse in the souls of others. For that forlorn face of an old man, he felt only a sense of horror. Surrounded in part by a shaggy white wig, and now flushed with wine, that face, despite its deep wrinkles, was still fleshy. The lower lip, dyed purple, hung a little downward, and the mouth seemed to wink lazily. Yet, because of the deep lines that marked its contours, it was a mouth not weak, but ruthless, menacing. "There is a boy in Parliament," the messenger was saying, buttoning his vest over his papers, "a Mr. Faunce, who has spoken with much acumen about the witchcraft laws. We should make him one of us." "I was there," said the scribe. He drank and put the glass down slowly. "Witchcraft!" he exclaimed with a quiver of anger in his voice. "If this year, 1736, has any merit, it is that it has witnessed the disappearance of witchcraft laws, and consequently of witchcraft, for it is the law and only the law that created witchcraft. And to think that until 25 years ago, in the middle of the 18th century, English law was killing women and young girls for witchcraft. Mr. Person, I grant you that witchcraft existed in Israel, but tell me honestly, was there really in England?" "No, there was not," replied the curé emphatically. Old Jem's eyes opened. Though clouded and watery, they nevertheless rested on the curate a firm and bold gaze, while his lips tightened into a belligerent expression. "Withdraw your no, curé," he said, "for I have witnessed witchcraft." "Yes, I have witnessed it with my own eyes, and in a place no farther than our town, over there." A shadow descended on his face, the kind of shadow the cure would not have expected to find there at all. It hinted that old Jem must once have come across something that had terrified even his steely mind. "In our city?" replied the cure. "I have never heard." "Of course not. It was in King Charles' time, no less than 60 years ago. Those who were involved with me have long since died, and it was something we did not want to talk about and hope to forget." Old Jem shook his head, his lips tight and his eyes clouded over. "But I have forgotten nothing, not a single detail." "Voila, then, Mr. Lombardiston," said the messenger. "Tell us the story." "No," said old Jem, lifting the snuff-box. "I would not have told you that either, had not the blood gone to my head at seeing the witchcraft laws dismissed by these brave individuals, too wise to believe in magic. And that Gardshaw, then, and the curate—" He paused, looking at the scribe and the curate in turn. "So you believe this is nonsense, Gardshaw, and you too, curate?" For a few moments his lips tightened, his face grew even harder, and determination grew in his eyes. Finally he blurted out, exasperated. "Very well," he shouted. "You shall have the tale, and if you go to the prison tomorrow you will find testimonies that will prove to you the truth of my words." So he rose and leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. The messenger said in a huff, "Good." Gardshaw muttered an apology, and the very interested curate had no more desire to leave. "Now listen!" ordered old Jem. His voice was wonderfully powerful for his age, and he imparted to the narrative an order and naturalness that was logical to expect from one who was formerly known as one of the best Tory orators in the House of Commons. "To begin," he said, "I must go back to the year 1667, when I was a boy of 17. In those days, witchcraft trials were quite frequent, as you know, and in the fall assizes of that year we had the case of a woman who lived in this very town. Her name was Shafto, Ellen Shafto. She was a widow. Her husband had been killed in the great battle of the 4 days with the Dutch fleet. She had 2 small children, a boy and a girl, and she herself was young, in her early 20s. She was also a beautiful woman, thin, smiling, with dark hair, a gentle curve of the cheekbones and a haughty bearing of the head, as I had begun to notice. But despite her loveliness and her poverty, she was known as an honest woman. Because she had been a seamstress at a milliner's shop as a girl, she supported herself and the children by sewing for people in the neighbourhood. Now there was another woman, I have forgotten her name, a neighbour of hers, who did the same work, and discord and jealousy arose between her and Mrs. Shafto. After a while it happened that this woman's right arm and hand swelled, so that she was in excruciating pain and could no longer sew. Old Dr. Peters could in no way make the swelling go away, and was breaking his head to find out the cause. A rumour spread that Mrs. Shafto had bewitched her arm, and this rumour was supported by the fact that the woman stood at the window with a silk robe folded over her own arm and her eyes fixed on her rival's house. At the trial, Mrs. Shafto, under threat of torture, confessed her guilt and was sentenced to hang. Now, note this well. She was to be hanged in the market square, in front of the Red Bull Tavern. In the morning, a crowd had gathered there, clamouring, shouting, and hatching the purpose of snatching her from the guards before she reached the gallows, to give her a death more heinous than that by hanging, for witchcraft is a crime that often drives people to madness. I was watching the scene from the Red Bull, and was rather nauseated because the witch was beautiful and I was young. Around 9 o'clock, the hour of the hanging, everything appeared even more horrifying to me because of the strange light of that day. It was November, and the trial had gone on for a long time. The sun had only recently risen, and it shone faintly through a gap that had opened in the darkness that floated above us. The market square was partly in shadow and partly shrouded in a strange, heavy yellow light, in which the faces of those who stood on tiptoe to see if the witch was approaching, faces with their teeth showing and eyes wide open, resembled wax masks. Suddenly the tower bell began to strike 9. The multitude suddenly fell to 0. Everyone was stupefied, because the Shafto had not yet arrived. But soon after we heard coming from the prison a high and angry cry, and we soon learned that the sheriff, aware of the crowd's intentions, had called Ralph Timmins, the executioner, and ordered him to hang Mrs. Shafto in her cell by hanging the rope from a beam. My father, who was in jail with the sheriff, told me that neither he nor the sheriff had witnessed the execution. They were with several others in the atrium in front of the front door, and the atrium was plunged into darkness, except for a beam of yellow light that reached them through the window of a room whose door, which faced the atrium, was wide open. Shortly thereafter, my father told me, Ralph Timmins descended the stone stairs and through the darkness was almost on the verge of falling on the last step. Waving to the sheriff, he said, "Sir, I have taken out the witch, as your grace commanded me." Old Jem paused to pour himself some wine. Immediately the scribe asked, "What about the other one's arm?" "It healed from that day," replied old Jem. "Oh, Ellen Shafto was a witch, no doubt, and perhaps her powers were broader than she showed. But she is not the witch of my tale, the supreme witch, more powerful than 20 Ellens. Now listen. As I told you, Ellen Shafto was hanged in 1667. Over the next 12 years I rarely came to these parts, but with my father's death in 1679, I moved here from London. I soon discovered that Ellen Shafto's children, the boy who was now 21 and the girl who was 18, still lived near the town, and one day I met the girl on the street. I recognized her immediately because she awakened in me the memory of her mother. She was younger, fresher, even thinner, but she had the same black curls, the same gentle curve of her cheekbones, the same seductive bearing. She was very different from her only in facial expression. Her mother was inclined to smile, her daughter's lips were pouty, though in a graceful way, and her eyebrows, slightly wrinkled, were indicative of a certain temper. I stopped her, asked her name. She told me her name was Nora, and also asked her where she and her brother lived. Shyly, but without showing me any courtesy other than that she had stopped, she told me that her brother had received a sum of money from a lady in London in whose service her mother had once been. With this money she had rented a piece of land that she cultivated, where they lived together. I talked with her at length, and had intended to slip a couple of guineas into her hand. But as the coins jingled in my pocket, I noticed a spark of storm in her eyes, so I gave up my purpose. And mindful of that spark, in turning away, I dared not bring my fingers to touch her chin. But in that moment I fell in love with Nora Shafto, and I knew that to possess her was the purpose of my life, and that she would fight against me fiercely. Old Jem's eyes, which seemed to grow gloomier the deeper he plunged into the past, lit up for a moment and scrutinized the curate, who discovered, to the dismay of his conscience, that in one thing at least he had not done old Jem justice. "I beg your pardon, curate," said old Jem, "for what I shall now say. But in order for you to fully understand my tale, I must speak clearly." His gaze drifted away from the curate. "As I said, I was terribly in love with Nora Shafto. I did not think of marrying her, even though, when it was too late, I would have married her 100 times over if it could have procured her for me. That she was the daughter of a witch, and perhaps a witch herself, did not matter to me. I was the kind of man who would have liked to marry a witch for fun, if she had been a good-born witch. But I was not the kind of man who would have married a seamstress daughter, even had her soul as white as an angel, and Nora Shafto could have loved me. During the time when she often allowed me to talk to her, I saw her affection for me grow, become impetuous, burn. But this was before she knew that I did not intend to marry her. Later, in the months that followed, I followed her, waited for her, pleaded with her in vain. The flame that had burned had gone out. I offered her everything she wanted, gems by the handful, gold in large quantities, even to the point of giving her the chance to reduce me to the ground. She refused everything, and I did not get even a kiss from her, except for a very slight one that I snatched from her. It happened near the horse trough, outside the city, one evening in May 1680. I had barred her way, and now she stood still, with her head tilted back and a proud look that kept me at a distance. His brow was furrowed, his eyes were filled with anger, and on his face next to each nostril 2 deep furrows were drawn, making him look old while not taking away his youth, a strange fusion that was damnably seductive. But in the end, his tongue and manner had hurt me so much that I was able to restrain myself only through a great deal of effort. And that evening, struck by her retort, I exclaimed, "Nora, in truth you are rather spiteful. You only respond with rancour and sourness to everything I say to you, while I have never addressed a word to you that was not courteous and kind. So far." She was not disconcerted at all by my new tone. Rather, it seemed to make her feel even more bold and confident. In her eyes there was less anger and even more contempt. Cold contempt, which makes the blood boil, especially coming from a person of low birth. "Yes, you are very kind, Mr. Lambardiston, to think of filling my ears with trinkets," he said, using an expression common at the time. "Cheap trinkets," he added, with an even more contemptuous look. "That they are cheap is a lie," I retorted, "and you know it." I tried to control myself. "Nora, I promise again to put around your fingers, around your neck, around your curls, trinkets that are worth the entire rents of this town. You will have all the gain, I will have all the expense." He shrugged his shoulders with a quick gesture, lifted his chin even higher, and deliberately turned his gaze away from me. "Ah, there's your mellifluous waffling," he said in a slow tone of disgust. "You will have all the expense, and you called me a liar. You shall have all the expense." "Oh," she cried, turning back to look at me, and I saw in her eyes that she hated me. "Oh, why didn't she choke you, that damn lie? You will pay with a little gold, but I have to pay with my soul. My soul. Mr. Lambardiston begs me to buy him a little fun. With my soul. Let us travel together to the land of love, he tells me, and I have to pay for his trip, with my soul." "Pooh, you are a scoundrel and a coward." Nora Shafto had a quick tongue, and her words indicated a better upbringing than was expected from one of her condition, because, after her mother's hanging, a local lady had taken her into her home and cared for her until her death. But this cutting invective revealed more acumen than she had shown me up to that point, and I was terribly fascinated by it, though I hid it with a laugh, believing that a kiss would be amends enough for offences. So I decided to have one instantly. There was a rider slowly descending the path toward us, but I took no notice and moved in Nora's direction, announcing my purpose to her. I noticed that, instead of stepping aside, she put her hand to the basket full of roots she was carrying. Then my hands gripped her shoulders, and my lips touched a corner of her mouth as she turned her head to avoid me. Immediately she stepped on my foot, snatched my hand from her shoulder and broke free as the basket slid to the ground, dropping all the roots. And from that pile he pulled out a long knife. "So, this is Mr. Lambardiston," he gasped. "Mr. Lambardiston, a nobleman who administers justice. Mr. Lambardiston, who was appointed deputy sheriff a week ago, a maiden attacker." He showed me the knife. "I want you to try again," he said, "because I see a gentleman coming who will swear I killed you in defense of me." I would have tried again, but the fellow had dismounted from his horse and was coming toward me with a grim air. Besides, I had no sword with which to prevent him from interfering, while at his side hung a long iron. Not to mention that, as Nora had sneered, I was deputy sheriff, and I would have made a poor impression if, because of an altercation with that horseman, that story had become public knowledge. So I walked away, limping on my wounded foot. "Witch spawn," said I, "you have the black soul of a witch yourself." I heard her hold her breath. I heard her move as if she wanted to assault me from behind, but then she said in a mocking tone, "I knew it. I knew your vulgar mouth would offend my poor mother. Oh, yes, I have a witch's soul, Mr. Lambardiston, and sufficient witch skills to escape your hands, no matter how hard you try." At these last idle words, as I considered them, I looked around for a moment and calmly enjoined her not to say dangerous things, for although I would never repeat them to her detriment, the newcomer was close enough to hear. After giving her this warning, I went home. 2 days later, her brother, Francis Shafto, a big guy with a stubborn face, barred my way with extreme impudence as I entered the city. He threatened me and told me that if I ever spoke to Nora again, he would beat me so badly with his cane that I would be bedridden for many weeks, and he added that any judge or magistrate would agree with him. It was clear that I had to get rid of him. That same day I wrote to a friend, second naval officer, and after a week 6 sailors went to Shafto's farm and forcibly enlisted Francis. It was a rather illegal thing, I confess. Hearing that he had been taken away while Nora was unconscious after struggling furiously to wrest him from the sailors, I became convinced that I had acted cunningly. His release would have been one more gift to offer Nora. I had not acted cunningly. I had made a fatal mistake. The first hint I had of the truth was the news that the sailors, heading for the coast with Francis Shafto, had been attacked by a rabid bull. Then followed the rectification that it was not a bull that had attacked them, but a black filly that, bursting suddenly through a gate, had aimed straight at them and, biting and kicking like a demon, had badly bruised one man, broken a leg of a second, and killed a third. Francis Shafto, whose hands were tied because of the battle he had engaged in at the farm, had been knocked to the ground first, but was not injured by the beast which, sinking its teeth into his jacket, had begun to drag him away. A sailor, however, having unsheathed his dagger, had struck the filly in the back, and the latter, having dropped Shafto, had run away. When this news reached me, I was about to leave for London. Apart from my satisfaction in knowing that Shafto was not injured, I took little notice of the matter. But on my return a few days later, as I was about to renew my attempts with Nora, I learned with astonishment that she was on trial on charges of having turned herself into a black filly and killing a sailor for the purpose of freeing her brother. I will tell you what evidence they had against her. The filly, after the blow she suffered at the hands of the sailor's dagger, was never seen again by anyone, nor was her owner or anyone else found who remembered meeting her. As the event unfolded, Nora had been away from home for a day, and had told her friends that she would follow the company, hoping to persuade someone to attack her to free her brother. She returned the same day the incident occurred. She was very tired, muddy, pale, and sore from a cut on her shoulder, which she had gotten, she said, by bumping into a fence in the dark. Now the tale of the filly and the dagger had gotten here before her, and since everyone knew about her mother, evil tongues were at work. The cut on Nora's shoulder was enough to put the whole town in an uproar. There had never been such a blatant case of inheritance of magical powers, and the power of this magic was in Nora. She was a far more dangerous witch than her mother had ever been. The magistrates were forced by popular fury to have her locked up in prison, only a few hours after her return home, and around the prison a crowd gathered, rumbling and threatening to lynch her, while everyone said that no one could feel safe as long as she was alive. I did not know whether to consider Nora a witch or reject the idea, but I was sure of one thing. No one would harm her or hang her if my influence could protect her, and I knew it could. Immediately, using my powers as deputy sheriff, I proclaimed penalties against anyone who created disturbances in front of the jail, and assigned a guard of men armed to the teeth there. Then I used the lash of my tongue against the magistrates who had ordered Nora's arrest and detention, instead of having the mob's troublemakers whipped. Then I went to Nora. My purpose was to dispel her fears at once, to tell her that I would see to it that she would not be subjected to the judgment, and that she would be released before the end of the week. And, as I hurried with the head jailer to her cell, I was sure that she would read this on my face, and that, out of relief and gratitude, she would greet me with a warmer welcome than she had reserved for me lately. When the jailer had opened the door, I ordered him to keep his distance and entered the cell, pulling myself behind the door. Nora greeted me with a gasp of her breath, a storming of her eyes. Although I had stopped, she, without abandoning me with her gaze, walked away to the opposite wall. She leaned against it, and, keeping her head reclined until she touched it, she began to rail at me, her voice low that at times became high-pitched with rage, and her palms pounding on the wall. Need I bring back his words? It was the voice of hatred, now twice as bitter, with the accusation that he had arranged the enlistment of her brother, and consequently was responsible for the situation in which she now found herself. For a while she would not listen to a single word I was saying, but suddenly she began to pay attention to my protests, an assertion that I would remove all danger from her, getting her released in a short time. As she listened, she seemed to grow cold. Her palms rested against the wall, her eyes quiet. Her face had turned marble, as they say. I didn't like the thing. "For your favour," he said at a pause from me. "Must I love you? Is that the bargain?" "A petty bargain," I replied. "I am not a man to save you just to force you to love me." "No, no, Nora. Nevertheless, I hope you will want to change your attitude toward me. And mind you, if you do, your brother will soon be discharged from the Navy." "Ah," she said softly, with dreamy eyes, eyes that were a magnet for me when I was with her. "So beautiful, so intensely expressive. Ah," she continued, "in truth there is no being more evil than you in this evil world. For, you see, you are an important person, and my poor life and that of my brother are in your hands. So, Mr. Lambaston, your honour should be such, should it not, that we and people like us could always have confidence in you. But what are you," he hissed through his teeth, "if my mother's spirit is here beside me, as I am sure it is, what must she think of you? Have you not an ounce of shame in tormenting me like this, in the room where my mother is undoubtedly present? Why do you say that?" She lifted her eyes to the ceiling. Following her gaze, I saw dark oak beams above us. I uttered an exclamation, for I was indignant at the cruel foolishness in the function of which Nora had been locked up in the same cell in which they had hanged her mother. "I will get you out of here," I said, moving a step to summon the jailer. But she, far from thanking me, held me back, declaring that she wanted to stay there, and that if I had her moved from that cell, she would beg Mr. Palmer, the prison governor, to bring her back to us. For a few seconds that strange vagueness returned in her eyes. I couldn't tell if she was talking to me or to herself when she said, "I remember my mother very well, even though I was so small then. She was sweet and affectionate, and the thought of her heartens me, now that I am accused like her. I feel like I am closer to her in this room than I could be anywhere else on earth." Her voice broke into a groan. "I longed for my mother, no one knows how much. She was all love and tenderness, while the world is loneliness and cruelty. I would be happy to go to her, though I would not want it to happen through my hanging." Suddenly her eyes, which were looking straight into mine, lit up. Her mind and body abruptly reawakened. She turned away from the wall and leaned toward me. "But I would rather have myself hanged, have myself roasted on the gridiron, than end up in your arms, you snarling dog. Yes, I would prefer it 1,000 times." It was clear that there was no arguing with her that day. I spun on my heels, wasting no more words, and as I walked away from the prison, I decided that the best solution was to leave her alone, until she had fallen prey to a stronger panic than she currently had. I would let justice take its course, and after the conviction, which I was almost certain of, I would get her pardon. Old Jem took a sip from his glass. After putting it down, he abandoned himself in the armchair, clasping his hands, without looking into the faces of anyone present. His gaze wandered sightlessly to the opposite wall. She was sentenced to trial in the summer assize. She pleaded not guilty and was not threatened with torture so that she would confess. In fact, the judge was old Jack Phillips, who did not believe in witchcraft, as was evident from his words to the jury. But the jury took only a few minutes to return a guilty verdict, and she was sentenced to be hanged in the market square, where her mother was to be executed. I had already arranged almost everything to obtain a pardon. After the trial, Jack Phillips combined his influence with mine, and 40 hours before the execution of the sentence, the pardon was already in my hands. But this time I wanted to put Nora on the ropes and deprive her of any fighting spirit. Holden, the sheriff, being bedridden with illness, I was in charge of the execution. I therefore decided to keep quiet about the pardon until my beauty was about to be dragged to the place of execution. Then the clamour of the crowd gathered in the market square would have convinced her that, despite the pardon, she would not be saved except by coming away with me and my escort and taking refuge in my house. I would have forbidden them to lodge her in the prison, and by paying drinks to the mob, I would have inflamed her to such a degree of ferocity that though she hated me with such intensity, she would not have dreamed of confronting it. Oh, I had locked the young lady in a trap whose only way out led straight to my house. With Grace under my pillow, I slept contentedly through the night that she deemed her last on earth. At early morning I set out for the prison. It was the clearest, sweetest July morning I had ever seen, and the hills stood out wonderfully in the sunlight, shimmering beyond the woods. I walked on foot to enjoy the air, having ordered a carriage to wait for me at the prison exit to take Nora and me home. The hanging was set for 9 o'clock in front of the Red Wall. As I passed behind the market square, I felt the air shake from the confusion and the hubbub coming from there, and at times the voices rising in cries of execration against her deafened me. The noise that enveloped me as I stopped in front of the jail to intimate a group of people to disperse was similar to the rolling of 1,000 tree trunks. I smiled, thinking of the storm that would brew at the news of the pardon. I had increased the number of men on guard to 50, and the indignation that the gentlemen I was to meet in the prison would show on learning that the pardon was a surprise for them alone. These same gentlemen, Governor Palmer, Judge Sir Hugh Gerald, and Captain Jones, were inclined to take offence at my bullying, as they called it. However, I could not see how the latter two greeted the news because, as it was not yet 8:30, I informed Palmer, begging him to inform them in turn, and went up to Nora's cell. On the way I met Ralph Timmins, the executioner, who had hanged his mother from a beam in that same cell. He was now an old man with a thin beard streaked with white. "There is commotion in the market square, your grace," he said. "It is as it was then with your mother, or worse, I dare say." He rubbed his chin with his knuckles. "A strange story, sir, a sad story, the story of these two, both so beautiful, two rosebuds." "There will be no hanging today, Ralph," I replied. "She has been pardoned." "But you will be rewarded anyway." Not wanting to waste even the time it took to get out some gold for him, given the eagerness I had to see Nora, I added, "Wait for me downstairs." The door to Nora's cell was open, and 2 jailers were standing guard on the threshold. I waved them away and entered. I noticed that Nora, hearing me coming, had turned pale. Perhaps she had not recognized my step, but she had thought they were coming to get her, to lead her to execution. When she saw me, her cheeks regained color, but the hollow line between her eyebrows was deeper than ever. She stiffened as the fingers of one hand spasmodically gripped a tuft of dark hair. "Well," I showed her grace. I lifted a finger, telling her to listen to the cries coming from the market square, reaching out to us, and I explained to her that only taking refuge in my home would allow her to escape the wild rage of the city. Until I stopped talking, her face did not lose its rigidity. Her eyes did not cease to stare malevolently at me. Then she lifted her gaze up, and her fingers sank into her curls. "Oh, my mother, mother, mother," she said, her lips so trembling that I thought she would burst into sobs. "Now come with me, Nora," I said softly. She had a single, strange, bitter sob. Then her gaze returned to rest on me. What would happen if I asked Mr. Palmer to keep me here? I wouldn't let him. I would have bet on it. "You are overbearing as well as evil." Then she spoke more firmly. "You believe you are the winner between the 2 of us. I, on the other hand, believe that I have spoken the truth, claiming that I have sufficient witch skills to be able to escape you." "Go ahead," I challenged her. She removed her fingers from her hair and pointed to Grace. "Until you give it to Mr. Palmer, who is the guarantor of my release, you cannot force me to leave or force anyone to take me from here, and I will not move unless Mr. Palmer or Mr. Drew comes and orders me to." Drew was the head jailer, one of the 2 men who were earlier on the threshold of the cell. He had witnessed her mother's death, and I think he took pity on her daughter. However flimsy Nora's arguments were, he did not argue. By meeting her demands, I would be able to get her into my carriage more quickly. I immediately set off for Palmer, telling Drew to accompany me so that he could then go back and get Nora. So it occurred to me that his bumptious mention of witchcraft powers might have had an ambiguous meaning. Perhaps she wanted to kill herself. Immediately I turned back toward the cell door, which her jailer was entering. Nora was in the position in which I had left her. I stopped the jailer and whispered to him not to let her out of my sight under any circumstances. Then, casting another glance at the girl's sweet, sorrowful face and her eyes that followed me grimly, I reached Drew. I found Palmer Jones and Sir Hugh Jarrow in the foyer in front of the main entrance, with Ralph Timmins a few feet away from them, looking expectantly at me. After a minute, Palmer had instructed Drew to bring Nora down, and then I had the pleasure of noticing that Jones and Jarrow were even more chollicky silent than I had expected. I assumed they were considering the reasons I wanted to bring Nora down to my house. I turned my back to them and stared down the stone stairs, waiting for Nora to appear. Then I remembered Ralph Timmins, and gave him 3 guineas, which caused him to profuse in great thanks. I took no notice, for I was all intent on scanning the stairs. My irritation was growing, for I could see that Nora was somehow managing to stall. "Palmer," I said then, "that girl is up to one of her own, the ungrateful little thing. Please go and get her yourself." I heard him move a step behind me, but then he said to Timmins, "Ralph, you go, and tell Drew to hurry up with her." "Yes, go, Ralph," I added. Timmins climbed the stairs with his quickest step. My 3 guineas spurred him on. However, when enough time had passed to reach Nora and bring her down, no one came. "They are looking for her cloak, or they are brushing her robe. Or even more likely, she fainted from happiness," Jones commented, at Palmer's observation that Ralph was long gone. "No, let's face it," replied Gerald. "The girl is not enthusiastic about Lamberdiston, and may the devil take me," he added. "I can't understand why we are staying to witness the meeting between that little girl and this gentleman." The grimace that accompanied these last words drew my attention away from the stairs. I turned, and was about to retort harshly when I was distracted by the sudden opening of a door. 3 men from the guard came out. They saluted us, and 2 of them walked past. The third, a sergeant, stopped to close the door. "No, leave it like that," Jones said. "A little light is coming." "By my faith," he continued as the sergeant walked away. "What a strange darkness has fallen these last few minutes. A storm is approaching." "And quite unexpected," Giraud added in amazement. He lifted his walking stick toward the lattice-covered window that stood above the front door. "No more than a minute ago the sky was a beautiful blue, Palmer. I was looking at it. And now, this same sky is the greyest I've ever seen. Suddenly—" His voice choked in his throat, his cane slipped out, and he tapped with the tip against the floor. "That I've ever seen," he repeated, with a strange astonishment in his voice. "Except once, one windy morning 13 years ago, as I stood in this very hall, and Ralph Timmins had come up to hang this girl's mother. This girl's mother, Jones, Palmer, do you notice the prodigy? I was right here with Sheriff Amphlett and with Harry Lambertson's father, and upstairs there was death for a witch, as there's about to be for his daughter, even for her in the cell, because it would have been dangerous to take her to the marketplace. Listen, you can hear the clamour of the crowd. So we heard it then, and through this hall." Garreau moved toward the door, and instantly his gaunt old face was illuminated by a ghastly yellow light, showing him staring and frightened, his lips twisting. "Yes, it is!" he cried, pointing up through the threshold. "There is the same sky as then." Being preoccupied with Nora's delay, I had paid no attention to the transition from light to dark until Jones had mentioned it. Because of the surprise, I was caught in noticing how thick the darkness was over us, except for the streak of yellow light coming from the room. I suddenly forgot my anger at Garreau, and hearing him talk about that other morning, I remembered what my father had told me. So as the yellow light wandered over Garreau's face, it came back to my mind with extreme vividness of how my father had spoken of the strange light coming from the open door in that same hall. And suddenly, for a reason I did not know, I felt my heart chill. I went next to Garreau and looked across the threshold at the window farther on. At that same moment, I had a shock. The sky was the same as the morning Ellen Shafto had been hanged. It was that same November sky, not a mere resemblance to the July sky caught in a thunderstorm. For the sun had set behind the high ground from which it shone as I made my way to the prison, and it shone faintly through a gap in the thick clouds, just as I had seen it from the Red Bull in my boyhood. Then its murky light had made Ellen Shafto's death even more terrible for me, but now, after staring at it for a few seconds, a blanket of horror had slipped over me on that morning when there was to be no execution. 1,000 times worse than the one that had enveloped me when the execution had actually taken place. "Garreau," I gasped, and looked at him. He was clutching his chin. His eyes were wide, vacant. His appearance was that of a man stunned and shocked by something he had just discovered. 13 years ago, he said confusedly, because the grip on his chin was blocking his mouth. "This day is 13 years ago, is November 1667. How can this be?" "Garreau," I shouted. His vacant eyes sought me out. They were sparkling and dismayed. He held his breath, removing his hand from his chin and reaching out, fingers stiff, toward me. "Lamberdiston," he said, "how you look like your father. But, you are him, Harry Lamberdiston, old friend." His hand fell affectionately back on my shoulder. I grabbed his arm to push him away, but I heard Jones talking to Palmer, and his words stopped me. "Palmer," he said gravely, "my dear cousin, Ned Alfort's finally died of his wounds in Martinique." Well, I knew that Jones's cousin, who had been wounded while fighting with Admiral Harmon in Martinique, had died in November 1667. In response, Palmer mumbled something about the Tangier fort and the Moors. He seemed to think he was in Africa, where he had once served, and then the tower clock began to strike 9. I clutched Garreau's arm tightly, for even though the source of the sounds was not near, every stroke seemed to pierce my senses, and in that horrid yellow light I was dizzy, frightful dizziness. For a certain interval I also felt strangely confused, for after leaning back against the wall and pulling Garreau beside me, I stood there bent over, thinking that my weakness and inexplicable fear were a disgrace, for me who had gained fame and glory in the Battle of Long Marston Moor. It was only when a full minute had passed that I remembered that it was my father who had fought at Long Marston 6 years before I was born. I pushed Garreau's arm away from me. Still bent over, I noticed that the others were motionless, their faces fixed in utterly perplexed expressions, and yet with restless eyes, as if in hypnotic sleep, meeting incessantly now with mine, now with those of the others. For some interval of time we remained like this, without saying a word, each, I think, straining to bring order to the confusion of his own thoughts, wondering if the others were as bewildered as he was. Then we recovered, just as I noticed that the light was no longer yellow and the lobby was sunlit again. Thanks to a sound of footsteps on the stairs, Ralph Timmins was coming down, alone. He came down one step after another, slowly, and despite the half-light that still enveloped the stairs and his distance from me, I noticed that an even more confused expression was drawn on his face than I had seen in my companions. Confusion, it was complete bewilderment. I knew from those wide blue eyes that he must have some painful mental turmoil. He was as if hypnotized. He looked like a man poised between a terrible dream and an even more excruciating awakening. Above his beard, streaked with white, even his lips were as white as marble. He moved slowly. At the last step he stumbled and nearly hit his head. It was then that Gerro's voice rose in a genuine wail. "Oh, look!" he cried. "What does this mean? What witchcraft is this?" I had watched as my father's words, recounting how Ralph Timmins had slipped on the last step, pierced my brain like a blade. That fall, and Gerro's exclamation, revealed the truth to me. I knew what Timmins, who was dragging himself toward me, his eyes fixed on my face, questioning me in despair, was about to say. I knew! My poor, wonderful Nora, who thought she had sufficient witchy talents to escape me, with what supreme skill she had wielded her magic. Timmins stopped and greeted me. "Sir," he said, "I have killed the witch, as your grace commanded me." Knowing I had waited petrified, but his words brought me back to life, to madness. I screamed once or twice, making the hall echo, as Timmins recoiled before me. With both hands I grabbed him by the lapel, yanking him, as if I wanted to hurl him against the wall. I struck him across the face. I drew my sword, cursed him, promised him all the tortures one man can inflict on another. Then, I cannot say why except that I had now lost my mind, I shouted, "Bring it! Go, and bring her to me!" And I threatened him with the sword. He wrung his hands in vain. "Your Grace, she is dead!" "Bring her to me!" I shouted. He turned and went toward the stairs. He went back up and disappeared around the bend as I once again stared down that empty stone staircase. I felt a hand tap my arm. It was Jones, for Gerro, somewhere behind me, was saying, "Look, the sky is blue and the sun is shining. Man, open that door, I'm dizzy." And the front door opened, I think by Palmer's hand. I did not look away from the stairs. I was tense, listening. Finally, from the curve of the stairs, came the sound of slow footsteps, the steps of someone coming down, carrying a heavy burden. Then Nora's little feet, in the grey stockings, appeared, stretched out into the air. I saw the hem of the robe, I saw the knees, covered by the robe and bent over Timmins' arm. A moment more and I would see his face, but I could not bear it. I turned with a leap, screaming, and ran out to my carriage. Old Jem put his hand over his eyes, standing still for a while. "Yesterday, after the rain," he said, in a suddenly low, broken voice, "I went for a walk and came home past the horse trough. I stopped on the path, thinking about Nora. It is the month of December, but it was May for me on the trail, and I could see Nora with extreme clarity, with her sweet, angry face, with her poor basket of roots, and her old knife, which, with all my heart, I wish she had pushed into me. Nora, who died 65 years ago." He abandoned his hand and lifted his chin. "This," he said, "is my answer to you gentlemen who so disdainfully despise witchcraft. Why Nora did not turn herself into a bird or a butterfly to escape me, why she did not make me blind or crippled with an evil spell, I cannot tell you. But in what she did she not demonstrate the highest magical gifts imaginable? He changed the heavens, turned time back to 13 years earlier. And while we in the hall were only half in the grip of the spell, she so enchanted Ralph Timmins and Drew, the jailer, that they, without a word, hanged her from a beam in the cell, believing they were hanging her mother. Afterwards I did not try to punish the two. Do you think I would have spared them if the circumstances had not been what I have told you?" Of those present, it was the curé who spoke. The signs of great pain shown by old Jem had not remained without effect for him, so that, as repulsive as the portrait of the man as a young man was, he could not help but feel pity for him. "Mr. Lambardiston," and his tone was sweet, "I believe that the account of that terrible event is true in every word, in the way that event was understood by you and others. But I believe that you were wrong as to its real nature. I do not believe that it was Nora's witch-like qualities that wrested her from you." "What, if not magic, could have done that?" exclaimed old Jem with growing anger. For a moment the curate was silent, then said, "Mr. Lambardiston, I would like to answer your question. What else? It is just an attempt to interpret, I dare not be sure, the event. Speaking of poor Nora, you used the word supreme. Reflect. Is it not the word we often refer to true power, quite different from witchcraft? The supreme power which stopped the sun over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Avalon, and repelled the shadow beyond the horizon, could not with equal ease have turned back the years for you who were in the dungeon, by thus decreeing that Nora, who despite all her childish talk about witchcraft, really had a soul as white as an angel." He paused. "Thus decreeing that Nora should join her mother," he finished, in a sympathetic tone. The colour had disappeared from old Jem's cheeks. The red of his lips had changed to a purplish tint, and growing despair and consternation were painted on his face. "I hadn't thought of that," the old man said in a whisper. "Ah, if that could be the right answer to everything. Cured." Then a new expression crossed his face, and for a moment his voice was firmer. "For Nora's salvation I hope it is, for that would mean heaven for her. But if this is the answer, cure, what will become of me? I believe that such things as the hope of Nora's salvation already do you honour and count in part in your defence," said the cure softly. "Besides," the king's messenger touched the scribe with his knee. The two stood up and lit their pipes at the opposite end of the room, having noticed that the cure had left his own chair to take one next to old Jem. And only after the two had concluded their talk with a long handshake did the smokers return to the table.